remember the sound first. I remember the smell: burnt metal, gasoline, and something sweet like antifreeze leaking through the air vents. When I finally opened my eyes, everything around me was quiet, like the world was holding its breath. The windshield was cracked in a spider web, the seatbelt locked against my chest, and my phone was flashing a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. The paramedics said I was lucky to be alive, but luck isn't the word I would have used, because surviving that crash wasn't an accident. It was a message. 5 days earlier, I'd inherited $11 million from my late aunt, the only person in my family who ever truly cared about me. I hadn't even known she was sick. The will came out of nowhere. Her lawyer called me while I was cleaning the kitchen. I remember him saying, "You should probably sit down for this." The moment the news broke, my life changed. My husband, Aaron, stopped looking me in the eyes. He started locking his phone, whispering in the hallway, saying he was working late, but coming home smelling like expensive perfume I didn't wear. I tried to ignore it. Money changes people, I told myself. But it doesn't just change them. It reveals them. 3 nights before the crash, Aaron came home with a folder. Inside was paperwork for a joint account he said we needed for tax reasons. When I asked why, he snapped, "Do you even know what you're doing with that kind of money?" I should have listened to the tremor in his voice. The next day, my car brakes felt soft. I told myself it was in my head. I took it to a mechanic. He said nothing was wrong. But that same night, when I pulled out of the driveway, I saw Aaron in the rearview mirror, standing on the porch, watching me. No wave, no smile, just watching. On the day of the crash, it was raining hard, the kind of rain that makes the world disappear in gray. I was driving to meet the lawyer to sign the last of the transfer papers. I remember hearing a sharp pop, then feeling the steering wheel jerk. The car slid sideways, tires screaming. Then everything went black. When I woke up in the hospital, Aaron was sitting beside my bed, pretending to be worried. But his hands were clean. Too clean. Like someone who washed away evidence. That night, I pretended to sleep. I heard him on the phone outside my room. His voice was low, tense. He said, "No, she made it. I don't know how, but she made it." That's when I knew. The crash wasn't random. Someone wanted me gone. I didn't say a word. I waited. I watched. For 2 weeks, he played the part. Flowers, soup, fake smiles. But I noticed the way he froze when the nurse mentioned the police wanted to inspect the wreck. A month later, I disappeared. I left without telling him where I was going. I took a new phone, rented a cabin upstate under a different name, and waited for everything to fall apart. It took less than 3 months. He remarried a woman named Claire, the same woman whose perfume I used to smell on his shirts. They posted pictures online, smiling, happy, new house, new life, until the day I showed up at their wedding. I didn't plan to, but curiosity is its own kind of addiction. I stood in the back of the church, quiet, veil covering my face. When Claire turned and saw me, she screamed because I wasn't supposed to be alive. And the look on Aaron's face, it wasn't guilt, it was terror. I thought the crash was the end of my story, but it was only the beginning. If you're still here listening, you already know this story isn't over. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about trust, money, and survival. So, before we go deeper, hit the like button to keep this story alive and type "I'm still here" in the comments. Because what's coming next, no one was supposed to hear. When Claire screamed, it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like recognition. Like she'd seen a ghost she knew too well. The whole church went silent. The pianist stopped mid-note. I just stood there, veil over my face, watching them both freeze. Aaron's expression was hard to describe. Shock first, then anger. But underneath it all, something else. Pure calculation. The kind of look you give when your plan suddenly starts to fall apart. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked out. The rain had started again. It followed me like a memory that refused to fade. I got into the car I'd rented under my new name, hands trembling as I turned the key. I could still hear Claire's scream echoing in my head. I didn't know what I wanted yet. Revenge, closure, truth. It was all tangled. But I knew one thing. I wasn't done. Not after what they'd done to me. For the next few days, I stayed invisible. No calls, no contact. Just waiting and watching. The news of the wedding spread fast. Photos, hashtags, congratulations. None of them knew the bride had screamed at the sight of someone who wasn't supposed to be breathing. I started digging. I still had my aunt's old lawyer on my side. His name was David Holloway, a quiet man with sharp instincts. He'd been suspicious from the start. He called me one night and said, "You were right to vanish. They filed for control of your inheritance 2 weeks after your crash." That hit me like another impact. Aaron had tried to declare me mentally unfit while I was still in the hospital. The paperwork was real. I saw my forged signature. They'd planned everything. David told me something else. He'd found a mechanic who remembered seeing Aaron near my car before the crash, but the man wouldn't talk, said he'd been threatened. That was when I realized Aaron wasn't working alone. I went back through everything. Texts, emails, even my old voicemail backups. One number kept showing up, unknown caller, always within minutes of Aaron's messages. I called it. It rang twice, then disconnected. A few hours later, someone knocked on my cabin door. It was a woman, mid-40s, gray raincoat, eyes like steel. She said her name was Detective Monroe. She claimed she'd been looking into suspicious financial activity tied to my husband's new accounts. At first, I didn't trust her, but she knew things no one else should have known. The make of my crashed car, the exact date of the fake joint account, even the VIN number. She told me Aaron's new wife, Claire, wasn't who she said she was. She had changed her name 3 times in 10 years, each time after marrying, each time after a sudden accident. One husband drowned, another fell from a balcony. None of them ruled murders. My hands went cold. The scream in the church made sense now. She hadn't screamed because I was alive. She screamed because she'd thought she'd seen her past come back to haunt her. The detective said they'd been tracking both of them, Aaron and Claire, for months. a pattern of targeting wealthy partners, moving money, then tragic events that conveniently freed up the funds. And then she said something I'll never forget. "We think your crash wasn't supposed to kill you instantly. They wanted you incapacitated just long enough to gain legal control." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees felt like whispers. I kept seeing the flames, the broken glass. The moment I woke up, with blood in my mouth and Aaron's voice pretending to care, the detective told me to stay quiet and keep my location hidden. But a few days later, the cabin phone rang again. Same blocked number. This time, I answered. There was silence. Then a voice, soft, female. "You should have stayed dead." I hung up and grabbed my bag. Within minutes, I was on the road, heading toward the city. I didn't care what it took. I needed to end this. I met David at his office. He looked pale, exhausted. "They know," he said. "They know you're alive, and they're trying to access the offshore accounts your aunt left." I didn't even know there were offshore accounts. He handed me a folder. Transactions, transfers, signatures I'd never made. Millions already gone. But there was one small detail that changed everything. The latest transfer wasn't to Aaron or Claire. It was to a charity in Delaware. The Holloway Foundation. I looked up at him. "Your name," and he didn't blink. "You don't understand," he said. "Your aunt didn't just leave you money. She left you the records. Someone powerful has been laundering through her estate for years. Aaron and Claire were just pawns." I didn't know whether to believe him. My head was spinning. Everyone I trusted had turned into a stranger. That night, I checked into a motel outside the city. The clerk said the credit card machine was down and wrote my name manually. 2 hours later, someone tried to open my door. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the bed. The handle jiggled, then stopped. Silence. Then footsteps fading away. I packed and left before sunrise. By then, I'd stopped thinking like a victim. I started thinking like someone with nothing left to lose. I bought a prepaid phone and called the detective. No answer. Then I tried David. His line was disconnected. That was when I realized I might be the last person alive who knew the truth. So I did the only thing I could. I started recording everything. Every call, every message, every detail of the crash, the inheritance, and the people involved. If something happened to me again, at least the story would survive. And that's when the emails started arriving. No sender, no subject. Just one line in the body. "Stop digging, or you'll wish the crash finished the job." I didn't answer the next 3 emails. I let them stack up in the inbox like threats stuffed under a door. Same sender field, empty. Same subject line, blank. Same sentence inside, spaced like it had been pasted by someone who wanted me to feel the gap between each word. "Stop digging, or you'll wish the crash finished the job." The 4th message had an attachment, a single image, a photo of my motel door from the outside, time-stamped 2 minutes earlier. I didn't stay to see if there would be a fit. I threw my bag together, left the key on the bed, and walked out like I was just going for ice. I didn't look back. The parking lot lamps buzzed with that sickly hum that vibrates in your teeth. There was a white sedan idling across from the office. I could see two figures in the front seats, faces lit in blue by a phone. I kept my head down and climbed into my car. My hands were shaking, but the engine turned over clean. When I pulled out, the sedan didn't move. I turned right, then right again, then took the on-ramp and merged into a river of headlights. I drove without music. I wanted the noise in my head to have a chance to speak. Every mile put distance between me and the motel, but it didn't put distance between me and whatever I had stepped into. Aaron and Claire had been the first door. David's confession about the foundation was the second. The crash had been the hinge. Someone else was holding the handle. I found a truck stop before dawn. I parked between two semis and watched the horizon turn from slate to ash to a thin band of orange that felt almost dishonest. I opened my laptop and connected to the public Wi-Fi with a throwaway email. I forwarded the threatening messages to the one address I still trusted. The backup account my aunt had set up for me the week she taught me how to file my own taxes and needed 2 passwords. One of them was her favorite dog. I hadn't thought about that scruffy terrier in years. The memory made my throat tighten. I opened a new tab and pasted the header data from the emails into a trace tool. Whoever sent them had used a relay service that bounced the messages through multiple countries. I ran it twice. Same result. But there was one mistake. The 4th email, the one with the photo, had a tiny slip in the chain. For a fraction of a second, it had touched a server in Wilmington, Delaware, without masking. I narrowed the search. The IP belonged to a shared office suite, the kind of place where small firms rent a mailbox and a conference room by the hour. One of the tenants listed under that address was the Holloway Foundation. I stared at the screen until the letters stopped being letters and turned into a pattern my brain refused to accept. I wanted to tell myself it was a coincidence. Shared address, common name. I typed in the foundation site. It was clean, modern, and vague. Mission statements about financial literacy, a handful of stock photos of classrooms, 3 testimonials that read like they were written by the same person. There was a downloadable annual report. I opened it. The numbers looked neat. Donor lists, grant disbursements, clean percentages. The auditor's letter was short, too short. I downloaded the PDF and ran a quick check on the metadata. Most documents of that kind pass through multiple machines. This one had one author, one machine name, DH Admin, created at 2:12 AUMM. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to my eyes. I could feel my pulse thudding along my fingers. David had looked tired when he told me I didn't understand. He had also looked oddly calm, like someone who knew exactly how deep the floor went under his feet. Maybe he wasn't lying when he said my aunt's estate had been used to move other money. Maybe he just left out who was doing the moving. I needed to see him. I needed to see his eyes when I said the foundation's name out loud. I waited until the traffic softened, then drove to his office through side streets with no pattern. I parked 2 blocks away, changed my jacket, and pulled a baseball cap low over my hair. I took the stairs, not the elevator. The glass door to the suite was locked. I pressed the buzzer and waited. No one answered. I pressed again. After a full minute, a click sounded and the door opened an inch. A young receptionist I'd never seen before leaned out. Her smile was polite in the way of people trained to look harmless. I said I was here for David. She shook her head and said he was out with clients. I asked when he'd be back. She said he's traveling. and looked down at her screen. I took the card holder from the counter and checked the names. Half the slots were empty. The ones left had different fonts, different paper stocks, as if the suite had been rearranged overnight. I asked if he had a cell number I could leave a message on. He said, "He'll reach out when he's free." She didn't ask for my name. I thanked her and left, but I didn't leave the building. I stepped into the stairwell and listened. Offices hum the way forests do. You can tell where life gathers by the notes in the air. There was one spot on the second floor where the sound changed. A copier chug, a pen tap, a muffled clack of heels. I pushed the door gently. It opened to a hallway with framed certificates. The name Holloway appeared on one, but the first name didn't, just a signature scrawl across a gold seal. I took a photo and kept moving, slow, casual, as if I belonged to the building more than anyone else. A door near the end was ajar. I heard a familiar voice. David. He was on the phone. He said, "No, she won't go to the police. The detective is already compromised." Then a pause. Then, because I made sure she would be, another pause. "I told you, she trusts the wrong people." It took effort to keep breathing quietly. I stepped back with tiny movements and slipped into the stairwell before the call ended. My hand found the metal rail. It felt cold enough to burn. If I had walked in and confronted him, I would have given him what he wanted. Another piece, another reaction to set. I walked out the back of the building and watched the glass reflect a stranger who barely looked like me. Then I picked a bench across the street and sat. If he was moving pieces, I needed the board. I needed to see who came and went. Two men in identical jackets left together and crossed to a coffee shop. A courier struggled with a rolling cart. A woman in a green coat looked up and down the sidewalk 3 times before entering. When she came out, she was carrying a slim envelope, and her face was pale. I followed her at a distance that made me one more body in the city. She turned twice, like someone who didn't trust intersections, and she finally stopped at a bus shelter. I stepped close enough to hear her call. "Yes," she said into the phone. "They made me sign confidentiality. No, I don't think it's legal. They said the foundation's donors require privacy." She paused and lowered her voice. There was a room without windows. I had to put my bag in a locker. The bus came, she boarded. I let her go. I didn't have a badge. I didn't have a team. I had a voice and a story that was getting heavier in my chest. I did the only thing that kept me feeling like I had a grip. I started narrating into my phone. Date, time, location, the receptionist's face, the certificates, David's exact words. When you put a record between yourself and the people who want to erase you, it becomes a shield. Thin at first, then stronger. I booked a day pass to the co-working space that shared an elevator bank with the foundation's suite. No one looks twice if you carry a laptop and a coffee. I set up at a corner desk with a view of the hallway. In the afternoon, a maintenance worker left a key ring on a cart while he took a call. I didn't touch it, but I memorized the color of the tag clipped to the one that opened the mail room. Blue, with a chip number printed in white. At closing time, a man in a dark suit with the wrong kind of shoes for a long day emerged from the foundation's door. He carried a case, not quite a briefcase, not quite a toolbox. He moved like a person waiting to be watched. He paused just long enough to register the room, then went for the elevator. When the doors closed on him, I crossed the hall and pressed my ear to the foundation's door. Silence. I pressed the buzzer. No answer. I took a picture of the directory and circled the mailbox number with my finger on the screen. Then I went back to the co-working floor and waited for the building to empty. At 9:43 p.m., the motion lights in the hallway timed out. Darkness made the place honest. I put on a jacket 2 sizes too big and a cap from the Lost and Found. I walked like a cleaner, slow, with purpose. The mailroom door had a keypad and a badge reader. I didn't have either, but I had a memory. Blue tag, white chip number. I typed the chip number like a code. The light stayed red. I tried it with the last digit up 1, then down 1. The light clicked green. It shouldn't have. I knew that, but it did. Inside, the mail slots were labeled with numbers, not names. The box circled in my photo matched a slot at eye level. There were 2 envelopes. One was a bank notification addressed to a numbered entity. The other was a small padded mailer with no return address and a faint smell of printer ink. I didn't open either. I took quick photos of both fronts and backs, slid them back exactly as they were, and closed the door. My hands felt electric. I didn't know if it would help later, but I knew it would help me now. The feeling of doing something. When I stepped back into the hallway, I wasn't alone. A woman in a black blazer stood halfway down the corridor, watching me without pretending not to. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She said, "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was even, no accent, nothing to hold. I said I was lost. She looked at my shoes, then at my hands. She nodded once, as if she had just checked a box in her head, and said, "The exit is that way." She pointed toward the elevator, not the stairwell. I thanked her and left. In the mirrored walls of the elevator, I watched her reflection until the doors closed. She was already on her phone. By the time I reached the street, my chest was tight. I walked fast for 2 blocks, then cut through an alley and slowed to a normal pace. When I reached my car, there was a note under the wiper blade. No words, just a printed photo of me sitting on the bench across from the foundation earlier that day. The back was blank, no thumbprint. Whoever left it wore gloves or knew how to handle paper like a pro. I folded it and put it in my glove box, then drove to a grocery store and threw it away in a trash can beside a stack of pallets. I didn't want to bring it with me. The prepaid phone buzzed when I turned onto the highway. Unknown. I answered. A man's voice. Not David's. Not Aaron's. Calm, like someone who had practiced calming other people. "You're in over your head," he said. "Walk away and you get to keep the rest of your life." I asked what the foundation was for. He paused, then laughed softly. "To help," he said. Then he hung up. I pulled over and sat with my forehead on the wheel. The air in the car had the stale smell of fast food and rain-damp fabric. I thought about my aunt, about the way she tied her scarf twice so it wouldn't slip, about the way she hid cash in the spine of cookbooks because she didn't trust banks. She left me money, but she also left me the weight of how she made it safe. If someone had used her estate, she would have fought. The thought tightened something in me until it clicked. I drove to her old house. It had been vacant since the probate process started. The realtor's sign out front leaned, and the grass had that defeated look that comes from too much weather and not enough care. I let myself in with the key I'd never returned. The alarm system had been shut off. The house smelt like dust and old citrus cleaner. I went straight to the kitchen and pulled the cookbooks down, one by one. Money fell from 3 of them, crisp bills wrapped with elastic that had turned brittle. I left the cash in a bowl on the counter. What I wanted was the ledger she always used. A red notebook with stiff covers and a habit of appearing when you needed a receipt from 2 summers ago. It wasn't in the drawer by the fridge. It wasn't under the sink with the trash bags. It wasn't in the freezer, which is where she kept anything worth keeping. I stood in the doorway of her bedroom and let my eyes travel the lines of the room like I was tracing her. The nightstand, the bottom shelf of the closet, the shoebox marked winter. There it was, the red book tucked behind a stack of folded sweaters that still held her perfume. I carried it to the dining table and opened it. Her handwriting held steady even when life didn't. Pages of dates, names, and amounts. Donations made, donations promised, favors granted, favors owed. In the back, a set of columns that didn't match the rest. Initials instead of names. 3 letters repeated. D-H-F. The Holloway Foundation wasn't new. It was old, older than me. The first entry with those initials was from the year I graduated high school. The amount beside it was small at first, then larger, then regular. There were notes in the margin in a different pen. Meet at the suite, use the back elevator. Bring cashier's checks, not wire. My aunt hadn't been used. She had agreed, or she had felt that she had no choice. I flipped the page and found a taped card, a number, no name, a rate, 2 points, quarterly. I didn't know what that meant at first. Then the shape of it showed itself. Money moving in circles that look like lines if you draw them carefully enough. Grants that return as fees. Endowments that anchor loans that buy property owned by friends. Everyone looks generous on paper. Everyone looks clean. I photographed every page. Then I put the ledger back exactly where I found it. As I closed the closet, the porch light outside flicked on. Motion sensor, or something else. I switched off the lamp and moved to the window. A car had parked at the curb, engine running. The silhouette of a single driver sat very still. I held my breath, counting. 10, 20, 30. The car didn't move. The ledger was warm from my hands. I slid it under my jacket. I left through the side door and crossed the backyard, through the gap in the fence that opened onto an alley I used to take as a teenager when I snuck out for midnight milkshakes. The past is not a map you plan to use, but it always knows its way home. I walked 2 streets over and called a rideshare from a different address. When the driver pulled up, I checked his plate twice and then got in. He asked if I was headed to the airport. I said, eventually, and gave him the address of a 24-hour print shop. I printed the photos of the ledger and paid cash. I put 1 copy in a manila envelope and mailed it to myself at the cabin address. I put a second copy in another envelope and addressed it to an investigative journalist whose work I had bookmarked years ago in a folder labeled, "In case no one believes me." The third copy went into a locker at the bus station with a code that no one else would guess unless they knew the name of my aunt's terrier and the year he died. The prepaid phone rang again while I was setting the locker code. A text this time, a single line, the same words as before, but with my name at the end. Not my married name, my birth name, the one I hadn't used since college. I felt the world tilt, just a little. Whoever was watching wanted me to know they could reach back before Aaron, before Claire, before David. I turned the phone off and dropped it into a trash can with a layer of sticky soda cups. Then I sat on a plastic chair and listened to the bus engines growl like tired animals. I slept for an hour with my head against my bag. When I woke, my neck ached, and the aches felt clean, the way honest pain does. I bought another prepaid phone from a vending machine that sold chargers and headphones in blister packs. I opened a new email with a name that meant nothing to anyone but me. Then I typed the detective's number and stared at it. The last time I called, she hadn't picked up. The time before that, she had told me to hide. I hit call and let it ring. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was lower than I remembered. I said I had proof. I said the foundation wasn't a shell, it was a blueprint. I said David was still in the building and he was not alone. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You can't do this alone." Then, softer, "I made mistakes." I asked if she was compromised. She didn't answer that. She asked where I was. I told her the truth and watched the station doors. She said to wait there, inside, in the camera's view. She said she would come with someone I could trust. I told her I didn't trust anyone. She said, "Trust the fear that is making you careful. Trust the ledger. Trust the copies you sent. And trust that they are afraid of you now." I ended the call and sat where the camera could see my face. The station smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times. A man slept with his mouth open on a bench. A woman argued quietly with a vending machine that ate her dollar. The world went on, because it always does. I pressed the envelope with the locker code against my thigh and thought about how sound returned after the crash, how the quiet lifted and the sirens came in layers, how the first touch on my shoulder made me cry, not because I was in pain, but because someone knew I was still there. I didn't know if the detective would come. I didn't know if the person she brought would be another mask. I knew only this: if I walked out of the station into the night without leaving more pieces behind me that told the story would end at the curb. So I opened the Notes app and spoke again. "If you're hearing this, it means I placed the copies like seeds, and I am following the path they made. My aunt's handwriting is now in 3 places that do not know each other. The foundation is older than anyone has admitted. The man I trusted helped build it. My husband and his new wife were not the architects. They were hired hands. The person who told me to walk away wants the ledger to disappear. If I disappear instead, the ledger will speak." Then I lowered the phone and waited for the doors to open. I watched the sliding doors and counted the seconds between each open and close. A rhythm makes waiting feel like a plan. The station cameras blinked their tiny red lights, and the floor smelled like old coffee and rain. I told myself I would give it 30 minutes. If she didn't show, I would move on and keep moving until the story kept me safe, just by existing in enough places to be hard to erase. 17 minutes in, she walked in like a person who knows people are watching. Detective Monroe wore the same gray raincoat and carried a canvas bag that could have held files or groceries. Beside her was a man in a navy jacket with quiet shoes and a face that was deliberately forgettable. They didn't rush. They scanned. They let me see them. She raised one hand, not a wave, just a small permission. I stood up and stayed in the camera's view. We sat on 3 plastic chairs near the snack machines. She set the canvas bag on the floor where I could see it. The man stayed slightly off to my right, angled toward the exits, like his job was to worry about doors. She said my name, the one I used in college. It was a small test. I didn't flinch. She said, "You did the right thing with the copies." I said, "I did the only thing I could do." She said, "Both are true." It was the first thing she had said to me that felt like truth faced forward. I asked if he was with her or with the foundation. She didn't look at him when she answered. She said his name was Carter and that he worked financial crimes at the state level. Not my city, not David's jurisdiction, far enough away to make favors cost more, close enough to get things done without press releases. Carter nodded once, like it was a greeting to the room, not to me. I took out the third prepaid phone and placed it face down on my knee. I told her I had the ledger, not just the photos. She took a breath so small a normal person might have missed it. She asked if it was safe. I said safer than I am. She didn't ask where it was. Good, she was learning. I told her about the Delaware server, the shared suite, the auditor's letter that read like it had been trimmed so the ugly edges didn't show. I told her about the receptionist who smiled without asking names, the certificates with missing first names, the mailroom keypad with a code that should not have worked, and the voice on the phone that said the foundation existed to help. I watched her face for the tiny twitches people make when something matches what they already suspect. I saw two, one at Delaware, one at the auditor's hour. She said my aunt's estate had triggered a soft radar years ago. Quiet donations that didn't match the income lines. Endowments that matured faster than the interest rates could explain. A pattern that looked fine if you skimmed. Her team had questions then, but questions do not always turn into cases. She looked at Carter and he looked at the floor. He said some donors are also elected, and some elected people sit on budget committee. Lines cross, pens move, numbers become clean because people say they are clean. I asked if she had been told to stand down. She didn't say yes. She said she had been told this was not a priority compared to harm with bodies attached to it. I said bodies were attached to this. They were just hidden under signatures. She held my eyes for 3 seconds and then glanced at the camera above us. I understood. Not here. She asked for my timeline in my own words. She had it already in pieces, but people tell more when they walk the road again. I spoke. The call from the lawyer, the joint account folder, the break that felt wrong, the crash, the hospital hallway, Erin's voice saying, I don't know how, but she made it. The wedding and the scream, the visiting card with David's name in its corners even when it wasn't printed, the first photograph of my motel door arriving while I was still breathless from moving my own luggage. When I finished, Carter said, You understand the risk goes up when you push. I said, the risk goes up when I stop. He didn't argue. Monroe asked me to say Claire's name out loud. I did. She asked how her scream sounded in the church. I said, like recognition, not shock. She wrote one sentence in a small notebook. Then she closed it. She didn't date the page. That told me this wasn't going into any system yet. She told me something she hadn't told me before. A grant in the foundation's annual report listed a school in my aunt's old neighborhood. The school had never received the funds. The principal had sent 3 emails and 1 certified letter and then stopped asking because there are only so many times people can humiliate themselves for help. She slid a photocopy across my knee. The signature at the bottom of the grant letter looked like David's scribble on the gold seal, the one that left out his first name. I asked if she could arrest him now. She said we would need more than a scribble and a ledger and a scream. She said we would need the path of $1 all the way through the cleaning machine to the hand that spends it. She said the person who spends it is not always the one who moved it, and that quartz like clean lines, even when life is made of knots. I told her I didn't trust that she was free to do this. She didn't defend herself. She said trust is a ladder and asked me for one rung. Give me one piece you have not given anyone else, she said, and if I move carefully with it, give me the next. If I trip, or if it leaks, you will know which rung broke. I thought about the small padded mailer in the mailbox slot. I had not opened it. I had not said it out loud. I had told her I had seen it and left it. She didn't smile, but something like respect moved across her face. She said that was good. She said we would go back for it, and we would go as if we were enemies. Separate. Cold. No eye contact. If they were watching, they would have to pick which of us to follow. I said that sounded like action. She said it sounded like paperwork. Carter asked where the ledger was again without asking. I pretended not to notice. He said he could start a sealed motion for subpoenas that did not look like subpoenas, the kind that ask for independent verification for an audit that is already on the calendar for another reason. He said you could learn a lot by asking plain questions in the right fonts. He said it quietly, like he was confessing a useful sin. I asked about the detective being compromised. She did not look away. She said a deputy commissioner had asked her to route any progress through a specific counsel's office. She said that counsel had once been a partner at a firm that had represented a donor with initials I already knew. She said she had not routed anything. She said she was now on leave. She said leave is another word people use for punishment when they cannot explain why punishment would make them look small. She said it without bitterness. She was past that. I told her I had mailed copies to myself and to a journalist, and that a locker held another set. I told her the locker code used a dog's name. She asked if the dog would be easy to find on my old social media. I said no. She said good. She said the journalist I chose does not publish until they have 2 sources and a third that confirms. She asked if I wanted that publication to be the pressure or the I said both. We sat in the hume of the station a while. The man, sleeping with his mouth open, snored once and turned his head. A bus driver walked in with a lunch pail that had a dent in one corner. Life kept its pace, while mine slowed into the kind of quiet you only get when you accept that the ground under you will not be steady again. Monroe asked about my aunt. Not her money, her. I told her about the scarf and the cookbooks and the way she preferred cashier's checks because she liked to look people in the eye when she handed over help. I told her about the time a pipe burst and my aunt made coffee on a camping stove for the repair crew at 3 a.m. I told her about the years I didn't visit because life had made me small, and how she answered the phone anyway when I called and never used the word forgive because it sounded like a transaction. She asked if my aunt would have joined a foundation like this on purpose. I said she would have joined anything that made her feel she could help more people this time than last time. I said the people who came to her with forms and seals knew the exact door to knock on, inside her heart. She wrote another line and didn't let me see it. I told her about the voice on the phone that said, "Walk away and keep the rest of your life." She said that voice belongs to a person who thinks they are still holding the handle. She said people who hold handles forget that doors swing both ways. She asked me what I wanted at the end of this, not just safety, not just money, what I wanted to stand when the dust settled. I said I wanted the school to get its grant. I wanted the woman I used to be to stop hearing metal and gasoline in her sleep I wanted a sentence somewhere in a legal filing that used all the names with first names and last names both. I wanted to put flowers on a grave without checking the mirrors twice. I wanted to hear someone say out loud that the plan failed because I did not stop telling the truth, even when I had to do it alone. She nodded like she would hold those words with care. She said we would not be doing it alone anymore. She said, alone is how they like it, because one person can be made to look confused. 3 people look like a pattern. 10 look like a case. Carter asked if I had noticed any accounts in my name that I did not open. I said yes, and handed him a list on a torn page. He didn't write anything down. He said he would remember. He said the people behind this do not steal the obvious. They borrow reputations to open windows and then leave them cracked for the next cold night. The station announcement chime rang, and a voice apologized for a delay that no one was surprised about. Monroe stood and said we should move. Not together. She told me to go to a public library 2 neighborhoods over and reserve a study room under a name that matched the initials on the ledger's last page. She said she would arrive an hour later if the street gave her permission. If she saw anything that smelled like rehearsed coincidence, she would not come. I asked how I would know if she had been stopped. She said I would not. That was the point. If it was quiet, I should go to the next step, and then the next. She would meet me where the paper trails crossed the air. I told her the ledger was not in a locker, and not at the cabin, and not on me. I told her that if I vanished, a message would go out with scans and notes and the name of the school that never received its grant. I told her that if she vanished, I would still say her name. She let that sit between us and then squeezed my shoulder once, like a person who knows how contact loads meaning. We left separately. I waited until she had cleared the doors and then counted 30 before I stood. I walked to the ticket counter and asked for a map I didn't need. I made small conversations with a clerk about the price of coffee that used to be cheaper. I stepped outside into air that felt like the top of a cold glass. I took a bus that veered across 3 zip codes and got off 2 stops after the library just to look at the street from the wrong angle before I walked back. The study room had a glass wall with a blind half drawn. I sat where the camera could see me and opened a notebook that had nothing in it but a grocery list. I wrote the names I knew and then cross-hatched them with lines I did not. The door opened at exactly the hour she had said. Monroe stepped in alone and closed it gently. She set a folder on the table and slid it to me, but kept her hand on it. She said, "This is what I can give right now." It was a list of 6 companies with similar names and identical mailing addresses. Each one had filed an amendment in the last 60 days. Each amendment changed a board member. The new names were nobody to anyone but a person who reads footnotes. But if you read them all together, they spelled a path that led back to the Foundation's mailbox. She said, "This is how they move when they think they are being watched. They change names to add noise. They move signatures to exhaust your attention. But they cannot change the dates. The dates are joints in the skeleton. You can align them and see the body." I told her about Claire changing names after each marriage. She said, "Same pattern, new costumes, same steps." She asked if I could live with being patient. I said, patience is not waiting. It is choosing what to do with a beating heart while you wait. She smiled the kind of smile that understands what it costs to be steady. Before she left, she put a small object on the table, a flash drive with a red sticker. She said, "Do not plug it into anything with a camera. Use a machine you won't miss when we burn it. Inside is a set of emails we pulled months ago and could not use because the warrant was wrong by one word. Wrong enough to make a judge angry, right enough to tell us who to ask the next time. The names will line up with your letter. If they don't, I have the wrong map. If they do, you will know how far this reaches. I asked if David was in those emails. She said yes. I asked if Aaron was. She said yes. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding. I asked if my aunt was. She looked at me a long time. Then she said, only in the ways someone kind gets used. She left me there with the drive and the map and my own breath loud in my ears. I felt something like grief and something like resolve take turns in my chest. I remembered the day the will was read and how the room felt too bright and how Aaron had stood behind me, not next to me like a person lining up a shot. I remembered the mechanic who would not talk and the motel door photo and the receptionist who smiled without name. I remembered the sound returning after the crash. I put the drive in my pocket and closed the notebook with the grocery list. On my way out, I stopped at the front desk and asked if the library accepted donations for the school in my aunt's old neighborhood. The librarian said yes. She handed me a form and a receipt book with carbon paper that left blue ghosts on my fingers. I wrote an amount I could afford to lose. I wrote my birth name. I took the receipt and folded it small and placed it with the locker code in my wallet. Proof is not only for courts, it is also for the person you become when you are tired enough to forget why you started. I stepped back into the evening. The streetlights came on with a soft click, each one speaking to the next along the line. I walked toward the bus stop, not fast, not slow, and felt the story shift. They had wanted me alone. Now I was not alone. They had wanted the ledger to be a secret. Now it was a lens. They had wanted my silence to make their signatures clean. Now my voice was the dirt they could not scrub out. My phone buzzed. A new email. No sender, no subject. A single sentence again. Stop digging, or you will wish the crash finished the job. Then a second email followed it, from an address I recognized. The journalist, a line and a question. I received your envelope. Is the school real? I typed yes. Then I added the principal's name and the number from the certified letter Monroe had shown me. I hit send and watched the message leave. Across the street, a woman walked a small dog that pulled at the leash like all it wanted in the whole world was to sniff one more patch of grass before bedtime. The dog's name tag caught the light and flashed a color I almost recognized. I smiled in spite of everything. Some lives are still ordinary. That, too, is worth protecting. I headed toward the corner, shoulder relaxed, eyes open. Tomorrow we would pull a padded mailer from a mailbox and see which way the paper ran when it met the air. Tonight, I would sleep in a place with more exits than beds and set 2 alarms. One for the morning, one for the memory of why I am still here. I didn't sleep much. I lay on the motel bed and watched the red glow of the alarm clock change in slow increments, breathing to the count of 4, the way the physical therapist taught me after the crash. When it was light enough to make the curtains gray, I showered, packed, and left by the side stairwell. I took 2 buses and a train that stopped at every station so I could watch the city wake up in peace. The copy of the ledger entries and the flash drive were in different pockets. The originals were where only one other person would ever find them if I didn't return. You treat a camera like it belonged to someone I used to be. I didn't look up at the shared office building like it belonged to someone I used to be. I didn't look up at the camera over the awning. If you treat a camera like a person you fear, it learns your face. I crossed to the coffee shop, bought a drink I didn't need, and sat at a small table with a clear line of sight to the hallway that led to the mailroom. When the barista called out 3 names in a row, the building seemed to exhale. At 9:23 a.m., a courier with a lanyard scanned packages and left a rolling cart inside the lobby. At 9:26 a.m., a cleaner propped the hallway door with a folded piece of cardboard. At 9:29 a.m., I texted a single letter to Monroe. She replied with the time, 9:37. We had agreed not to walk in together. Her entrance would be purposeful and plain, the way officials move when they're looking for something and cannot afford to find it too quickly. Mine would be the kind of motion buildings ignore. I stood, tossed the drink, and crossed the street with a steady pace. In the lobby, the courier was gone. I kept my gaze soft, not landing on anything long enough to feel like intent. The hallway smelled faintly of toner and citrus. The mailroom keypad blinked a patient red. I pressed the chip nutter variation again, the one I had tested by accident last time. The light clicked green. I stepped in, closed the door, and turned the latch so it looked closed to anyone glancing from the hall. The slot I had photographed held the same 2 envelopes. The bank mail looked untouched. The padded mailer was lighter than I expected, like it held something that weighed more in the mind than the hand. I pulled it an inch, stopped, and slid it back exactly as it had been. Then I took a breath and pulled it again, this time all the way out, tucking it flat against my coat so the camera above the opposite corner would not get a clear angle if it was there. I didn't open it in the mailroom. I relocked the door, walked past the directory without slowing, and pushed through the lobby doors as if I had remembered an errand elsewhere. The street was brighter than it had been a minute earlier. I kept going until I reached the next block and turned into the entry of a copy shop that sold tape and pens and the feeling of being anonymous. I bought a manila folder and a cheap pair of scissors. At the back, near the self-serve printers, I stood with the envelope resting on a laminated table that had been cleaned so many times it looked fogged. I slit the top slowly, like it might bleed. Inside was a small black key fob, the kind that opens a door with a beep and a light, and a folded sheet of paper with a single sentence printed in a sans serif font. If you want to see how it started, use the basement. I turned the fob over in my hand. On the back, scratched near the edge, 3 numbers. 204. Not printed, scraped by a pocket or a habit. The type of mark people make when their hands are busy with other things. I put the fob and the note in the folder, paid for a ream of paper I didn't need, and left. I messaged Monroe from the 3rd prepaid phone. We used the phrasing we had practiced, words that looked like errands if someone read them over our shoulders. I wrote, "I have the recipe." She wrote back, "Oven on in 15. I took that to mean she was moving, carefully, with the kind of caution that signals experience rather than fear. I did not tell her about the key fob in a text. Text are postcards. We met 2 blocks away in a lobby with a fountain that made the air damp. She didn't break her path toward the elevator, just brushed my sleeve with 2 fingers and kept walking. I followed a moment later and caught the next car. The basement required a badge. I pressed the key fob to the reader, expecting nothing. It chirped green, and the elevator doors closed with a soft seal that made my stomach flutter as if the floor had moved a fraction before my body did. The basement corridor was painted a shade that made it feel like a place people were not meant to stay long. Storage cages lined one wall, numbered with printed labels that were not quite straight. The other side had 2 doors, electrical and facilities. The fob worked on neither. At the end of the hall, a 3rd door sat slightly off to the right, unmarked, with a reader below the handle that looked newer than the paint around it. I pressed the fob. The light flashed and the lock gave. Inside, a small room waited with a metal table, a chair, and a camera in the corner that looked broken in the way a person looks asleep when you want to believe they are. I didn't sit. On the table lay a tablet device, screen dark, and a single folded document sealed with a cheap sticker. Monroe stepped in behind me and closed the door without letting the latch catch. She scanned the ceiling once, then the corners, then me. She nodded at the tablet and the document and said, "Your choice." I said, "The paper first. Paper has edges you can feel." I peeled the sticker and unfolded the sheet. It was a service invoice from a garage I had never heard of, with a date 2 days before the crash, a line item for caliper inspection, and a handwritten note, "Paid cash." At the bottom, a name, not the mechanic who had refused to speak, a different name, one I recognized because it had appeared in the ledger's margins as a tiny set of initials. That didn't match any grant recipients. I felt the breath leave my body in a way that made my chest ache. I had seen those initials beside 3 payments the year my aunt had surgery, and I couldn't figure out why they would be there in a book of gifts. Monroe watched my face. She asked if I knew the name. I nodded. She didn't ask how. Her eyes moved to the tablet. She said, "It will wake to the fob." I pressed the fob to the tablet's corner. The screen blinked, then opened to a gallery of videos labeled by date and time. The earliest time matched the invoice. The thumbnail showed the back of a car that looked exactly like mine, recognizable by the small scratch on the bumper I had never gotten around to fixing. I tapped the first video. The image was grainy but clear enough. A man in a hoodie lifted the car on a jack in a private bay and removed a wheel with quick, practiced movements. He set the wheel aside and reached into the assembly with a small tool. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't need to. He worked like someone who had done this task in rooms where cameras were a rumor. Another man stood at the edge of the frame, with his hands in the pockets of a coat that hung too well to have been bought for this job. When the hoodie moved aside, the man in the coat stepped forward. He held a phone to his ear and said words I could not hear. Then he nodded at the caliper like he had just given a blessing. Monroe leaned closer. She paused the video and pointed to the reflection in the bay's small window. The coat created a sliver of a face. It was enough. It wasn't Aaron. It wasn't the mechanic who had refused to talk. It was David. Could it speak? I felt the way skin feels when it registers heat before the mind understands where the flame is. Monroe rewound, played the sequence again, and then again. On the second recording, an hour later, the hooded man returned alone. He put the wheel back on, set the car down, and rolled the jack away. He sprayed something near the brake line and wiped the residue with a cloth he put into a bag with gloved hands. The timestamp showed the job finished at 2:03 a.m. I opened the next clip. This one showed the same bay the following night, with a different car, not mine, and a different plate. Same sequence. Lift, remove, reach, replace. The pattern felt practiced enough to make me nauseous. There were 3 more clips, each a variation. In one, the man in the coat signed a paper the camera couldn't see. In another, the hooded man handed a stack of cash to someone off camera. In the last clip, the hooded man sat on a stool, alone, and rubbed his eyes like the act had worn him down to something softer than intention. I turned off the tablet and let my hands rest on the table until the tremor settled. Monroe took out her phone but didn't photograph anything. She stood with her back to the camera in the corner, eyes on the door, listening, the way police listen when they aren't sure who owns the floor they're standing on. She said, "This is a piece that fits in multiple puzzles." She didn't say case or charge. She said piece. I put the tablet back exactly where it had been. I slid the invoice into the manila folder and handed her the note that came with the fob. She read it, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that looked like a decision forming. She asked if I wanted the footage to go to the journalist now. I said no, not yet. I wanted to know who placed it there and what else they wanted me to find. She agreed. Reluctantly, she said that meant someone had designed this for me to see and for me to carry. She said the design was either a rope or a path. We left the room, relocked the door, and walked out of the basement separately. I kept my eyes on a point 3 feet ahead, as if that were where balance lived. On the street, the sun had shifted just enough to throw a new light across the front of the building. I bought another coffee I wouldn't drink, crossed to the bus stop, and sat. My hands made small circles on the paper cup. Motion helps when the mind is still spinning without direction. The prepaid phone buzzed. A text with a photo. The same bay, same angle, but a different day. The caption read, "Bring the ledger." No sender, of course. No subject. I looked up and scanned the street, like a person searching for a familiar face in a crowd where no one was familiar. I sent the photo to Monroe with no words. She answered with a location pin 10 blocks away, in a park with a pond and a row of benches that all looked identical until you counted the scratches. I walked there, slow enough to seem unhurried and fast enough to make the urge to run sit down and breathe. On a bench near the water, I sat and took the flash drive from my pocket and rolled it between my fingers like a small totem. Monroe arrived without Carter. She sat one bench down and angled her body in a way that made us look like strangers sharing the same view. She asked about the text. I told her. She asked if I had told anyone about the fob. I said no. She said good. She said if someone wanted the ledger, they would create an urgency that made bad decisions feel like the only ones available. I asked what she thought was in the padded mailer besides the fob. She said likely a track, not for the door, but for the person who uses it. I looked down at my coat and felt heat wash through my chest. She told me not to panic. She said there are trackers that hold battery only long enough to see if you make the first move. She said we had the information we needed, and we would treat the fob like a specimen now. She took a small anti-static bag from her pocket, and I dropped the fob into it. She sealed it with a piece of tape torn with her teeth. She didn't apologize for the improvised lab work. She said, "We work with what we can hold." We talked next steps. The tablet gave us times and faces. The invoice gave us a shop. The text gave us intent. The ledger gave us a motive that was broader than a marriage and colder than jealousy. She said this is where patience becomes a tool instead of a burden. She said she would put quiet pressure on the shop through a licensing inspection that had nothing to do with brakes and everything to do with fire code. People talk when their comfort shifts by a degree at a time. I asked about David. She said we don't show him the board yet. We watch where he runs when the ground under him moves half an inch. She said the man in the coat who supervises sabotage a day before his client's spouse crashes is not sloppy. He is careful, which means he is careful everywhere else, which means he has a habit we can measure if we know where to place the ruler. I told her about the scratched numbers on the fob, 204. She nodded. She said basement levels and suite annexes use numbers like that more often than people think. She said it could be a code for a secondary access people forget to check because they believe cameras always watch the main hall. She said she would look, not loudly, quietly enough that only the right lock hears her. We left the park separately. I bought a notebook at a drugstore and wrote nothing in it. I checked into a different motel under a name that felt odd on my tongue and put the flash drive into a laptop I had pulled from a thrift store shelf that morning. I had paid cash and wiped it in the cafe while the clerk fixed the Wi-Fi for another customer. I disabled the camera and the microphone with a piece of tape and a small sticker the librarian had given me when I donated to the school. The drive held a folder of emails in PDF form with headers printed like a stamp, a list of attachments that had been stripped, and threads that ran across months with the monotony of planning disguised as process. The names were the ones Monroe said I would find. David, a man with a government address that matched a budget office. A consultant who wrote in bullet points with no verbs. A woman whose signature block changed titles twice without explaining how she got promoted. In one thread, the word grant appeared in quotes, as if to remind everyone involved that it meant something other than what the public thinks it means. In another, a meeting agenda listed vehicle procurement, which could have meant fleet maintenance if not for the next line that mentioned a donor golf event in the same breath. I read until my eyes burned. I ran searches on phrases that seemed harmless and found them again in contexts that made my throat tighten. Phrases like pilot program and bridge loan and advisory board. Each time they occurred near the same dates the ledger listed as payments out. I built a map by hand with arrows and circles on the blank pages of the notebook. When I reached for my phone to take a picture, I stopped. Some maps should not exist on devices that can be taken and searched. I slid the notebook under the motel mattress like a teenager hiding a diary and sat on the carpet with my back against the bed frame until the cramp in my leg told me to stand. The new phone buzzed once. Monroe. She texted a photo of a city permit list with 3 shops highlighted. The garage from the invoice had failed a recent inspection for storing hazardous materials without proper signage. The inspector's note said, "Follow-up scheduled." Monroe added a line, "I am the follow-up." I exhaled in a way that felt like a promise kept. I asked if I should send the tablet videos to the journalist now. She said to hold 12 hours. She said sometimes the space between knowledge and publication is where leverage lives. She said if we push too soon, we get a headline and no case. If we push in the right hour, we get both. I trusted that because I needed to trust something. Evening came and the room turned the color of old wallpaper. I heated water in the coffee maker and poured it over a cup of noodles I wouldn't taste. I put the hoodie I had bought at a thrift store on the chair in a way that made the room look occupied if someone glanced through the window. I took the ledger copy and studied the handwriting again, willing it to tell me one more thing I had missed. At the bottom of a page near the middle, a line of numbers followed by a short name I hadn't noticed before, Tally. I traced the ink with my fingertip. My aunt wasn't poetic, she was practical. Tally meant count, or it meant a person who counted for her when she couldn't. I wrote the word in my notebook and underlined it twice. Then I pulled the bus locker receipt from my wallet and checked the code the way a person checks a heartbeat. Still there, still mine. I slept with my shoes on and the flash drive in the pillowcase because the human body remembers how to protect what it cannot replace. I met Monroe at a laundromat the next morning. Spinning washers make good cover. She slid me a folded printout of the garage's staff list and pointed at a name that matched the initials on the invoice. MM. She said the man was on shift in an hour and that she would be conducting a routine follow-up. She asked if I wanted to sit in the coffee shop across the street and watch, or if I wanted to be further away. I said I wanted to see his face when he realized the old ways weren't holding. She said, then sit near the window, and if anything looks staged, stand and walk away without looking back. When the time had come, I took a seat where the reflection in the glass would let me watch the shop without turning my head. Monroe went in with a clipboard and a bored expression that looked exactly like every inspector I've ever met. 5 minutes later, she was in the bay with MM, pointing at a fire extinguisher and a storage cabinet. He nodded and scratched his neck. When she gestured toward a camera mount, his eyes flicked to a corner and away, the way a person glances at a wound. She came out 20 minutes after that with 2 forms signed and a receipt for a fine that wouldn't hurt anyone but would remind them the world notices small things when it wants to. She passed my table like a customer going for napkins, left a sugar packet beside my cup, and kept walking. Inside the sugar packet was a note in tiny printing. He asked if we could reopen the sanctioned bay. He said it like a person repeats a phrase he was told to use. Sanctioned bay. The words made my skin crawl. Sanctioned by whom? I messaged her the question. I didn't want to speak aloud. She wrote back, by the donor. Then, the same donor appears in an email on your drive. The initials are there if you look sideways at the signature. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. I returned to the motel and opened the drive again. I scrolled to the emails with signatures that looked like a block of text rather than a name. On the third one I saw it. The capital letters of a job title hid another set of capitals nested in the same order that the ledger used for the foundation and the audit firm that signed off at 2:12 IEM. I let my eyes go soft and then focused hard. There it was. An arrangement so simple it worked, because no one looks at what they assume they already understand. The donor wasn't a person with a golf course smile shaking hands next to a giant check. The donor was an entity that funded entities, that funded the foundation, that announced grants that never arrived. The head was a room, not a face. I started to write the structure in my notebook and stopped. Instead, I recorded a voice note, calm and steady, stating the path as if I were reading street names out loud while driving a route a child would learn. If you are me tomorrow, I said, and you are tired and your hands won't stop shaking, this is where you turn. Ledger to initials, initials to signatures, bays to brakes, brakes to crash, crash to will, will to control, control to David, David to the basement, basement to the tablet, tablet to the donor, donor to the school that never received a check. When I finished, I sent the note to the backup email with a subject line that looked like a grocery list. Then I called the journalist and left a voicemail that said only, I can show you a map. I didn't say when or where I let the weight of the words do their work. That evening, a message arrived from an address that looked like numbers thrown together after midnight. It contained a single PDF, a contract template for consulting services, with a clause that allowed for vehicle testing under controlled conditions. There were no names, just blanks and initials. At the bottom, a line for payment terms, cashier's check preferred. The metadata said it had been created on a machine with a generic name, but the time zone setting didn't match the city. It matched Wilmington. I forwarded the file to Monroe and then printed it in the motel office, while the clerk looked bored with the human condition. I folded it into the notebook and circled the words that twisted meaning into permission. Controlled conditions. The phrase made it possible to say everything without saying anything that could be pinned to a wall. At midnight, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. A new email, this time with an address I recognized. David, no subject. A sentence, so simple it tasted like metal. We can fix this if you stop. I stared at the words until they blurred. I typed back without sending. You fixed my brakes too. I erased it and wrote instead, return the school's money. Put your name on the line. Confess. I deleted that too and closed the phone. I lay back and listened to the hum of the air unit. I thought about Claire's scream, about Aaron's eyes when he saw me in the church, about the way David's coat hung like a decision. I thought about my aunt's ledger and the way she wrote tally like the word itself could make numbers behave. I decided I would not meet David. I would not answer that email. I would not let the people who planned rooms like the one in the basement decide the terms of my breathing. At dawn, I packed again. I took the notebook, the drive, the printouts, and the copy of the invoice. I left the noodles, the hoodie decoy, and a note under the mattress that said only, if you are reading this, the ledger is with the person who taught me to tell the truth, even when my voice is small. It was true. In a way, the person was me tomorrow, and the journalist the next day, and Monroe the day after that. The truth had more than one mouth now. On the way out, I stopped at a pharmacy and bought a stack of stamped envelopes. I addressed one to the school that never got the grant and placed a photocopy of the grant letter inside with a handwritten line. This was promised to you. Watch the news. I mailed it at a blue box that groaned like it was older than anyone wanted to admit. Then I walked to the library and booked a study room under the initials that had started to feel like coordinates. Monroe arrived with 2 coffees and a face that looked like it hadn't slept. She put a small velvet pouch on the table. Inside was a micro recorder with a switch you could flip with a fingernail. She said, people tell the truth when they think recording devices look expensive. They lie when the device looks cheap. This one is cheap. It will make them feel safe. I asked who. She said, M.M. She said he had asked for the sanctioned bay to be reopened because someone told him to push for it. She said she had given him a number to call if he remembered anything else. He called 30 minutes later. He said a thing that sounded like a hint even to the part of him that didn't want to speak. He said the man in the coat always paid cash, always signed for deliveries as if he worked there, and always said, we do it this way because the donor wants over. He didn't say which donor. He didn't have to. The word had been used like a shield in the emails too. We decided I would meet him in a place with no doors that locked from the outside and a camera that belonged to a business that did not owe favors. We chose a diner that had been open since the 70s and still served coffee in thick mugs that could crack a tile if you dropped them. I sat in a booth with my back to the wall and the recorder in my pocket. When MM walked in, I knew him from the video, not his face, but his shoulders. Studying nothing, Travis said. They carried the shape of a habit. He slid into the booth and looked like a man waiting for the second shoe. I said thank you for coming. He stared at his hands. He said he wasn't a bad person, I agreed out loud. In my head, I left the sentence unfinished. He said he did work he didn't ask questions about because the questions didn't change the answers. He said the night of my car, he was told to look at the caliper and not to leave marks that would fail a casual inspection. He said he had a child and health insurance that made him cry from gratitude and fear. He said he had not slept in 3 nights because a woman came to his bay with a clipboard and knew where to point. I asked him about David. He said the coat man didn't use that name. He used the foundations. He said the coat man walked like he owned time. He said the coat man had a way of touching tools like they were his, and that made everyone else pretend it was normal. He said the last time he saw the coat man, the man said the word donor as if it were a person who could enter the room. I asked about the camera that had filmed the bay. He looked surprised. He said the bay had never had a camera. I told him about the tablet in the basement of the shared building. He swallowed hard and said, then, there is more than one room where this story is being told. He slid something across the table under the menu, a folded card. On it, a name and a number with no area code because local numbers didn't need them on cards from 20 years ago. He said the card came from the person who set up deliveries. He said the person wore a green coat in summer and winter and ate crackers like a habit. He said the person's eyes never stayed on a face long enough to remember it. He said if I called and asked for a part number that did not exist, the voice on the other end would tell me the real name for the sanctioned bay. I put the card in my pocket. The recorder ticked quietly like a nervous heartbeat. I asked if he feared for his job. He said he feared for the truth and for what would happen to his kids' school if money stopped coming from places that said the right words in public. He said he had seen the school's name on a list once and then on the list again, as if it had been given twice. He said the principal had visited the shop to ask someone he trusted for help and left with nothing but a tired smile. He said the principal had hands that looked like they carried paper and children both, and you could tell which weighed more on a given day. We left separately. I walked past 3 storefronts and took out the recorder with fingers that felt too large for my own hands. I pressed the stop switch and felt the device hum once. A small confirmation that what had been said would not vanish simply because someone wished it would. I messaged Monroe and told her I had the card and the recording. She wrote back, "Good. Then, do not call the number yet. Then I am at the shop. The sanctioned bay door has a different code. It is not on the city's map. It is on a list someone printed in small font and taped inside a drawer." I went back to the library and booked another room. I took out the flash drive and the notebook and the recording and the card. I laid them out like utensils. I let the pattern sit in the air until it felt like air. Then I called the journalist and said, "Tomorrow, bring an open mind and a scanner. I will bring a map you can walk." When I hung up, a message arrived from David. 2 words, "Last chance." I typed a reply I knew I wouldn't send. I typed, "For you, not me." I deleted it and turned off the phone. I looked out the glass at a child dragging a backpack that seemed to hold rocks instead of books. The child's mother adjusted the strap and smiled with that tired joy that carries families across long bridges. I thought of the school, the grant, the principal, the ledger, the bays, the donor that was a room. I thought of my aunt writing tally in a neat hand that carved honesty into columns. I thought of how the world had tried to teach me that quiet people are easy to erase. I stood and gathered the pages. Tomorrow would be louder. Tonight, I wrote one sentence on the first page of the notebook in block letters. I could read even if my eyes went blurry. We will count out loud. Sleep started coming in pieces like bad reception. I would close my eyes for what felt like minutes and wake up hours later, throat dry, pulse racing as if the crash were happening again in slow motion. I kept seeing the rain through the cracked windshield, the way drops found their way through glass that shouldn't have let anything through. I'd hear Aaron saying my name, the one syllable that used to mean safety before it became evidence. I tried to eat, but food had started tasting like metal. I'd hold a fork, bring it halfway, and set it back down. My stomach didn't know the difference between hunger and fear anymore. Monroe called just before dawn. She said, "You sound like you're falling apart." I said, "That might help me blend in." She didn't laugh. She told me the man from the shop had gone quiet, that his phone was off, that the door to the sanctioned bay had been welded shut overnight. She said she could feel the pressure from above her now, like someone had reminded the department she still existed. When the call ended, I sat in the dark and counted the seconds it took for my heartbeat to settle. 62. 62 beats before the world felt like it had a rhythm again. I started hearing sounds that weren't there. Tires sliding, a seatbelt locking, glass sighing under stress. The body doesn't care about calendars. It carries everything like an archive that keeps updating itself without permission. I opened the notebook and stared at the line I'd written the night before. We will count out loud. It looked foreign, like someone else had left it for me to find. I traced the letters with a pen until the page almost tore. At noon, I walked to the diner again. Same booth, same cup, different coffee. The waitress recognized me and asked if I wanted the usual. I said yes because it was easier than explaining that I didn't remember what the usual was. When she left, I took out the recorder and pressed play, just to prove to myself that MM's voice was still captured in plastic and wire. The tiny speaker hissed, then spoke his confession in a monotone that made my skin prickle. Every pause sounded heavier than words. When it ended, I replayed it, quieter this time, and felt my eyes sting. I wasn't crying for him or for me. I was crying because the sound of truth coming from a machine felt more trustworthy than people ever had. A bell above the door rang. I looked up too fast. It was just a delivery man with boxes. Still, my hands shook until the waitress refilled my cup. She said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I said, "Maybe I have." When I stepped outside, the light hit me wrong. Too bright, too clean. The street seemed smaller, the air thinner. My legs carried me to the park without asking my permission. I sat on the same bench and watched the same pond. The ducks moved in circles that never overlapped, like they understood territory better than people. My phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. The words were plain: "Stop meeting her." I stared at it until the screen dimmed. No name, no threat beyond the simplicity. I could almost hear the calm in it, the confidence of someone who believed distance could undo what had already been set in motion. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the motel. I walked until my feet hurt, then checked into a different place under a fake name I forgot 5 minutes later. The room smelled of bleach and loneliness. I left the light on because darkness started making noise. Sometime after midnight, the phone rang again. I let it buzz 6 times before answering. A woman's voice said, "You should rest." I said, "Who is this?" She said, "Claire." For a moment, the world went silent. Then the sound of breathing filled the line. Hers, mine, overlapping like static. She said, "They'll hurt you if you keep pulling at it." I said, "You already tried?" She whispered, "I didn't, I swear. I didn't know." I wanted to hang up. I didn't. I asked, "What didn't you know?" She said that it wasn't about you. Then the line clicked dead. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to decide if that had been real or another trick memory pulled when the body runs out of adrenaline. I replayed it in my head. The tone, the pacing, the way she said it wasn't about you. Each word felt rehearsed, like someone had told her exactly what to say if I ever answered. The next morning, Monroe texted a single question. "Are you safe?" I typed back, "Define safe." She didn't respond. I walked to the library again, sat in the back corner, and opened the notebook. The words started blending into drawings, lines, arrows, the outline of a car that looked more like a wound than a machine. My handwriting began to slant. Somewhere in the middle of the page I wrote, "Maybe the crash never ended." For hours I tried to piece the timeline back together. The crash, the hospital, the wedding, the foundation, the basement. Every event felt like a bead sliding on a wire that was too thin to hold weight. I couldn't tell which parts were sequence and which were loops. I started recording voice notes for myself. "Today is Thursday. You are alive. You have the ledger. Monroe exists." Saying the facts out loud anchored me more than writing them did. I played them back between phone calls just to hear myself speaking in a tone that didn't sound afraid. By evening, the hallucinations had shifted from sound to image. I'd catch glimpses of my aunt standing near doorways, scarf tied, eyes patient. She never spoke. She just watched, as if waiting for me to keep counting. Sometimes I'd smell her perfume, orange peel and soap. Then it would vanish like it had been edited out of the air. At 2 a.m, I woke gasping, convinced I heard the screech of tires outside. When I looked, the street was empty. Still, I packed my bag. Every time I left a room now, I left a copy of something behind. A page, a photo, a voice memo on an old phone. It was a breadcrumb trail for a stranger who might one day believe me. The next afternoon, Monroe called from a payphone. Her voice was sharp, focused. She said, "The donor isn't just a name, it's a system, and that system knows about you." I asked how she knew. She said she got a call from someone high enough to end her career if she kept pushing. Then she said, "If they reach out to you, don't answer questions. Ask them why the school never got paid." After the call, I sat in the park again. The pond looked the same, but the air felt heavier. My reflection in the water didn't look tired anymore. It looked hollowed out, like it was already halfway gone. I started talking to my aunt out loud. "You picked me for a reason." I said. You left the money, the ledger, the mess, but you never told me how to live with it. The ducks didn't care. The wind didn't either. But saying it made the space around me feel less empty. That night, I dreamed of the crash again. Only this time, when I looked through the broken glass, I saw not Aaron but myself standing on the porch watching me drive away. I woke up sweating, shaking, the sheets twisted around my legs. I didn't try to sleep again. I just sat there until dawn painted the room gray. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't trust my senses. Every shadow looked like movement. Every phone buzz made my pulse spike. I left the motel and walked aimlessly until I found a small chapel that smelled of dust and wax. I sat in the back pew and whispered to no one, "If I disappear, let the ledger speak." The words sounded thin but honest. When I stepped outside, sunlight hit my face and made me dizzy. I leaned against the railing until the spinning slowed. I realized the exhaustion wasn't just from lack of sleep. It was from carrying a truth that refused to stay quiet. I checked my phone. Another message waited, unsigned. "You're close." I laughed out loud, a dry, broken sound that startled a passerby. Close to what? To the end? To proof? To madness? I walked until my feet bled through my shoes. Somewhere near dusk, I found myself standing in front of my aunt's old house again. The for sale sign still leaned in the same direction. I opened the gate, sat on the steps, and let the quiet wrap around me. I thought about how she used to hum when she cooked, how the sound filled every corner. I wanted that kind of noise back, the simple, domestic kind that meant life was ordinary. I closed my eyes and spoke into the recorder. If this is what surviving feels like, maybe surviving isn't the right word. Maybe it's just continuing. I pressed stop and listened to the silence that followed. It was the first silence all week that didn't feel hostile. When I finally stood to leave, the porch light flicked on again. Motion sensor, maybe memory. I whispered, "I'm still counting." Then I walked away into the night, each step landing heavier than the last, the echo fading like the sound of brakes cooling after too much heat. I woke up on a bench outside the chapel, with my coat pulled over my knees and a taste in my mouth like pennies. For a second, I didn't know where I was. Then the smell of wax and old wood caught up to me, and I remembered the pew, the whisper, the way the quiet had finally felt almost kind. Morning traffic hummed somewhere beyond the trees. I checked the time and felt that small punch of panic again, the one that arrives when sleep steals pieces of your plan. A journalist texted at 8:03 a.m., a location and a single word, "Today." I read it 3 times. I said yes and tucked the notebook under my arm like a living thing. Before I left, I put my hand on the chapel door and said out loud, "I'm still counting." It made me feel less alone. We chose a museum cafe that opened early and filled quickly with tourists who would never notice a quiet conversation at a corner table. I arrived first and sat facing the room. When she walked in, she looked exactly like somebody who has trained her face to be forgettable. Neutral coat, neat hair, eyes that scanned without lingering. She ordered tea and sat. No handshake, no small talk. She put her phone face down, and then slid a small notebook halfway out of her bag, like a signal to both of us that everything would be on paper first. She said, "Tell it like you're giving directions to a place I've never been." I started with the ledger. I described my aunt's handwriting, the initials, the dates that lined up with events no one connected in public. I told her about the school, the grant that never arrived, the principal's certified letter. I showed her the copy of the letter and the receipt from the library donation with blue ink that had bled through the carbon paper. She wrote the principal's name and the letter number and underlined both. When I said David's name, her pen paused. Not long, just enough to tell me the syllables had a weight she recognized. When I said Wilmington, she didn't move at all. That stillness told me more than any nod. I played the recording of M.M. We both listened without speaking. The clink of cups and the low murmur of the cafe felt like wallpaper over something that should not have been allowed to exist. When it ended, she asked, "Can I get a copy?" I said yes, but later, from a different device. She didn't push. Whale it. I took out the printouts from the flash drive, the emails with headers and signatures that weren't names until you softened your eyes. She traced a finger along a line that read, "Vehicle testing under controlled conditions," and said softly, "They always think phrasing will protect them." She asked if I had the tablet. I said no. I told her what was on it. She asked me to draw the bay from memory. I did. Clumsy lines, a small square for the window that had betrayed a reflection. She looked at the drawing like it was a map to something treasure adjacent and said, "You don't realize how useful this is." Halfway through my second cup, my hands started to tremble so badly I had to hold the cup with both. The journalist watched without pity and slid a small packet of sugar across the table, like a nurse treating a symptom. She said, "You aren't crazy." I said, "I wish I were." Crazy would mean the world could go back to normal if I took a pill and a nap. She wrote a line in her notebook and tore the page out. She folded it once and pushed it to me. I didn't open it then. I didn't trust what I'd feel if I read whatever she'd written. I asked if she would publish. She said eventually. She said publication without prosecution becomes a story that briefs later we'll call allegations. She said if we want this to stand, it has to carry weight in rooms where people prefer air freshener to honesty. She said, "I'm with you, but we have to walk in step with the kind of truth that survives cross-examination." I told her about Claire's phone call. She frowned. She asked what exactly Claire said. I repeated it word for word. "But it wasn't about you." The journalist wrote that sentence alone on a clean page, boxed it in, then wrote above it, "Motive shift." She asked if I had answered David's email. I shook my head. She said, "Good." She said, "Silence makes people reveal their shape." She asked if I had told anyone else about the ledger besides Monroe and her. I said no. She said, "Keep it that way until we place safeguards." Then she slid another object across the table, smaller than a flash drive, more like a button. She said, "Clip this inside your coat when we meet again. It records locally for 90 minutes. It won't save your life, but it might save your story if someone tries to rearrange the facts." We agreed on a plan. She would verify the school and the principal and pull the grant records from public filings. She would contact the auditor listed on the foundation's report, as if she were researching charities for a piece about local giving. She would ask innocuous questions that forced the wrong people to check with their counsel, and then she would watch who calls her back. I would keep moving, keep leaving copies where copies should go, and I would not meet anyone alone who had ever used the word donor like a spell. When we stood, she put a receipt on the table with a number scribbled on it. "This is the one I answer if the other one goes quiet," she said. She told me to look at the folded line she'd given me earlier, only when the room felt small. After she left, I waited 5 minutes and then opened it. She had written, "Exhaustion is their tactic. Eat something warm." Then she'd drawn a tiny square and inside it a dot with an arrow labeled, "You are here." I put the paper in my pocket and felt steadier than I had in days. On the way out, my phone buzzed. A new text, same unknown style. A location pin I recognized immediately, the church from the wedding. A time 2 hours from now. A single letter, C. I stopped walking. The letter could have been anyone. It could have been a trap. It could have been Claire. It could have been the person writing scripts for her mouth. I stood on the sidewalk until a man with a stroller asked if I was okay, in that careful way people ask strangers to stay human. I sent the pin to Monroe with a question mark. She replied with 2 words, "Your call." Then, public place, cameras, exits. I stared at the map and the old anger lit up like a flare. I typed back, "I'll go." I approached the church from the side street where the trees cast lace shadows on the pavement. The doors were open for a weekday service. People came and went without looking at me. I sat in the last pew near the aisle where no one could stand behind me without being seen. 10 minutes passed, 15. The small organ near the front made a soft, breathy sound as someone tested a key. When I turned my head, she was there. Claire sat 2 rows ahead, hands clasped, hair pulled back tight enough to lift her face. She didn't turn around. She spoke in a voice calibrated for the distance between us. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Why here?" She said, "Because he won't follow me inside." I wanted to laugh at that, but the tired part of me understood that people choose superstitions when logic fails them. I said, "Who is he?" She said, "The one who pays." "The donor?" I asked. She nodded. Then she said, "Not a person, a circle. People who pass the envelope and call it a mission." I asked, "Did you know about my car?" Her hands tightened. She said, "I knew about the account. I knew about the papers. I didn't know about the night. I didn't know about the rain." She inhaled and exhaled like each breath was a decision. She said, "I told him it would be cleaner if you signed. He said you were stubborn. He said stubbornness makes people clumsy." I felt the pew wood under my palms, smooth from decades of hands. I said, "Did you scream because you saw me alive, or because you saw what might be done to you if I was?" She turned her head then, just enough for me to see one eye. It glistened. She said, "Both?" We sat like that, 2 strangers tethered by a lie we didn't fully volunteer for. She said a name then. Not David. Not Aaron. A different name. The green coat. The person who ate crackers as a habit. She said the person schedules things so they look like coincidences. She said the person introduced her to Aaron at a fundraiser she hadn't planned to attend. She said, the person chose the photographer for the wedding and arranged the car service that never showed, so she would owe a favor to a driver who had a different favor to collect later. I asked for proof. She said, "I have a card, no area code." I thought of the card MM had given me and felt the air shift. She said, I kept it in my wallet under our marriage license. She almost laughed when she said marriage. The sound held more fatigue than humor. She said, I think I wanted protection. Money looks like protection until someone shows you the fine print. I could feel the recorder-shaped weight of the clip in my coat. 90 minutes. I had turned it on before I walked inside. I kept my hands still to hide the tremor. I asked, why tell me any of this? She said, because I'm tired of being a character in other people's plans. Because when I screamed, I saw my future, and it wasn't a house or a baby or a calm breakfast. It was a hallway with a door at the end that never opened. It was a hallway with a door at the end that never opened. She said, I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to let me hand you something that will make your map clearer. She slid a small white envelope backwards between the hymnals. I waited for the woman in the next pew to stand and leave before I reached for it. Inside was a photocopy of a ledger page that wasn't mine. Different handwriting, sharp, precise, not my aunt's. Numbers matching weeks I had underlined, initials I already knew, and one additional line I didn't. A short name, Tally. Next to it, an amount and the words, petty cash. My throat tightened. I said, where did you get this? She said. He kept a drawer. He liked to make little lists and check them off with a thin pen. He liked to feel close to the ink. I asked, who is Tally? She whispered, the one who cleans the leftovers. The person who turns hashed out dollars into envelopes that buy favors that look like kindness, not a title, a nickname. She said, if you call the card and ask for Tally, they will ask, who's asking? And then they will hang up, but they will write your name on a list, whether you said it or not. I put the copy back in the envelope and slid it under my thigh. I asked if she would testify. She said, if I'm still here. Then she stood and walked forward like she intended to kneel. She didn't. She kept going out the side door and was gone. I sat there after she left and waited for my breathing to steady. Then I walked outside into a sky that looked like it had been washed in cold water. I texted Monroe, Tally is not a word, it's a person. She answered almost immediately, that tracks. Then, where are you? I sent the church pin and wrote. She gave me a page. Monroe replied, do not go straight back to your room. Move 3 times, then call me from a landline. I almost smiled. The way she said move 3 times reminded me of my aunt's stovetop lessons. Simmer, wait, then stir. I rode 2 buses and sat in a laundromat for 20 minutes and then bought a stamp at a corner store before I found a phone booth that still worked and didn't smell like last night. When Monroe answered, I could hear typing in the background. She said, we pulled a call log from a municipal vendor list. The green coat appears 3 times as a visitor at the building with the basement door. Not a recorded employee, a visitor. Each time the sign-in desk wrote the same thing in the notes. Donor liaison. She said the term is fake. It exists to make you feel like money can behave itself. I told her about Claire. She didn't comment on character. She said, we use what helps and we inspect where it came from. She asked me to read the numbers from the photocopied ledger line. I did. She hummed like a person tracing a thread through a maze. She said, that amount appears in a petty cash fund for a summer program that never ran because of a staffing shortage that only existed on paper. She said, We're getting there. I went back to the museum and sat on a bench near the coat check where families argued gently about who lost whose ticket. I pulled out the folded note the journalist had written me and read it again. Eat something warm. I bought soup and forced down half of it and felt the world come back into focus by 1 degree. Heat can be medicine when your mind thinks ice is appropriate. My phone buzzed once more. A new message from the number with no name. Same sentence as before, but this time with an addition. Stop meeting her and stop counting. I set the phone on the table and let the words sit there like a dare. Then I opened the notebook and wrote slowly, deliberately. I will stop counting when the school gets its check. At dusk, the museum closed and the staff politely asked everyone to leave. Outside, the air smelled like rain, thinking about committing. I walked to the bus stop and felt the familiar prickle between my shoulder blades. I did not turn around. I let the reflection in a storefront window show me a figure 50 feet back, walking when I walked, stopping when I stopped, a hat brim, a coat that could have been any coat. I took out my phone and turned on the camera like I was checking my hair. The lens caught a blur that might have been a person or might have been the city shrugging. I boarded the bus and sat near the driver. I watched the figure stay on the sidewalk. I asked the driver to tell me when we passed a police precinct. He nodded like people asked him for that all the time. When we rolled by brick and blue lights, I got off and stood under the camera at the station door. The figure didn't follow. The rain started soft and then steadier. I let it soak the edges of my coat and felt cleaned in a way showers never manage. And then I felt cleaned in a way showers never manage. Back in my room, I unpocketed the clip recorder and plugged it into the thrift store laptop. The file loaded with a timestamp and a length that made me exhale. 90 minutes. All of it there. Claire's words were not a full confession, but they were a map marker. I saved the file to 3 places, labeled it with a boring name, printed a transcript, and slid a copy into an envelope addressed to my backup email's physical storage service. Redundancy has a taste, and it is bland and safe. Just after midnight, an email arrived from the journalist with a single line. Principal confirmed. Board chair evasive. Auditor defensive. Another line followed. We go slow, but we go. I felt something like a thread pull taut between us. Not friendship, not trust exactly, but alignment. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and imagined the map on my notebook wall stretching from my aunt's kitchen to the basement door, to the school office, to the sanctioned bay, to the church pew where 2 women exchanged a piece of paper like it was a life raft. I closed my eyes and did the counting thing again. 4 in, hold. 4 out, hold. The smell of gasoline didn't come this time. The crash didn't replay. Instead, I heard my aunt's humming fold into the sound of the bus engines and the fountain in the museum lobby and the organ's single key in the church. Ordinary noises that suggested a world beyond my fear. Before I slept, I wrote 1 more sentence in the notebook. Letters steady for the first time in days. Tomorrow, I call the card and ask for tally. Then I drew a small square and put a dot inside and labeled it with a date. You are here. I woke to the sound of my own voice on the recorder. the last note I'd made before sleep. Tomorrow, I call the card and ask for Tally. For a moment, I didn't remember recording it. Then the shape of the night returned. The museum, the rain, the email from the journalist, Claire's envelope in my bag, the map on my notebook. I sat up too fast, and the room tilted, as if the world had been set slightly off level while I was unconscious. I breathed into 4, held, out to 4, held, until the tilt eased. The motel curtain leaked daylight around its edges. Cars hissed through wet streets outside. I told myself I would eat before the call. I put on my shoes and walked to the corner place that sold eggs at all hours. The plate came hot. I took a bite, tasted salt and heat, and forced a second. The food hit my stomach like a question. I held it there with tea and waited for my hands to stop trembling. When they did, I paid cash and asked the cashier if there was a payphone nearby. He pointed with his chin and said behind the bus depot, if it still works. On the way there, a delivery truck braked, and the soft squeal sent a line of cold up my spine. Rain smell mixed with diesel, and some part of me flashed to the intersection. The tires, the breath that stuck like a stone in my chest. I told myself the street was today, not then. I said it out loud once, quiet, so my body would have something to follow. The booth behind the depot was scratched with names and half-scraped stickers. The handsets smelt like old plastic and disinfectant. I wiped it with a tissue and fed coins in one at a time, listening to the clink like it was a clock. I took out the card MM had given me and dialed the number without the area code. It rang twice, then 3 times, then a click and a silence that felt attentive. A voice answered with a word that could have been hello if you didn't care about letters. I said I needed a part number and gave the one MM told me did not exist. There was the smallest pause, the kind of pause a person makes when they decide what version of themselves to present. The voice said, "Who's asking?" I said, "The ledger." There was another pause, longer, with a soft clatter in the background like a drawer half closed. The voice said, "Wrong channel." I said, "Then give me the right one." Paper rustled. The voice said, "Basement, 20 past, back elevator, use the fob." Then the line went dead. I stood there with the receiver still against my ear and felt each heartbeat landing cleanly for the first time in days. I hung up, wiped the handset again, and left by a different street. I messaged Monroe from the 3rd phone. "Call made." She replied with a single period, the signal we had agreed on, for I heard you moving. I didn't go straight to the building. I waited in a cafe across the avenue and watched the clock on my phone tick around to the 1/4 hour. A woman at the next table set a cup down, and the ceramic click sounded like calipers settling. I finished the tea, left the cup half full so it would look like I had just stepped to the restroom, and walked out with my bag close against me. The back elevator required a key. I used the fob and the antistatic bag Monroe had given me. It chirped green through the plastic. The elevator doors closed and my stomach lifted in that small, weightless way that used to make me nervous as a child and now made me alert. When the doors opened, the hallway looked the same. Paint color designed to discourage lingering, storage cages numbered without care for straight lines, the unmarked door slightly off to the right. I pressed the reader. Green inside the table, the chair, the camera that might have been broken. On the table, not a tablet this time, a cardboard box with a strip of packing tape and a single sheet of paper folded twice. I didn't touch the box. I unfolded the paper with my fingertips on the corners. It was a printed invoice template with blanks where names should go. At the bottom, in small type, a line that read, "Petty Cash Reconciliation." The numbers matched the line on Claire's copy. Underneath, handwritten in a thin, exact script, "Tally for Q3. The lowercase t hooked down like a small anchor. I took a picture with the thrift store laptop camera covered, just enough exposed to catch the page without catching the room. Then I slid the paper under the box the way I found it. I listened. No footsteps, no metal cartwheels, no key turning. The air felt stale with the smell of dust and something like dry ink. I picked up the box. It was lighter than a box should be if it were full of paper. I tilted it and heard a soft slide inside, a small item rolling from one side to the other, then back. If this was a trap, it was a quiet one. I put the box back and left the room, closing the door until I felt the latch catch. In the elevator, I looked straight at the seam where the doors meet. I pictured my aunt's handwriting to keep my face steady. On the ground floor, I crossed the lobby as if I had found the vending machine disappointing. Outside, the air hit me with the damp weight of clouds. Waiting to decide, I walked 2 blocks, turned left, then right, then slipped into a copy shop and stood in the aisle with the pens, heart thudding in a slow drumbeat now. I texted Monroe, box and a note. Her reply, "Do not remove." I texted, "Didn't." Her, "Good, watching." I understood then that I was not the only creature in this small maze. Someone had placed bait. Someone else had placed a camera. More than one set of eyes were waiting to see who would touch what. I bought a pen I didn't need and left. Back in the motel, I opened the notebook and drew the room, the table, the box, the folded paper. I wrote the thin script's T and practiced the angle twice until it felt in my hand, like it had felt in my eyes. I marked the time I had been in the room to the minute. I recorded a voice note with the sound of the hallway in the background, so the quiet would have company later. A journalist texted. Principal gave me a copy of the certified letter and the receipt from the post office. Board chair won't return calls. Auditor says he doesn't have to talk to reporters. Then a second line. Good news. Small donor from 2 years ago says they never got a tax acknowledgement for a 5-figure gift. If it was processed, it was processed off books. I typed back, "Off books has a person. Their name is Tally." She answered with a dot and nothing else, the way Monroe did, when words would make more noise than signal. The phone rang an hour later, a number I didn't know. I let it pass to voicemail and then listened to it with my recorder, recording the playback. A man's voice, rough around the edges, said, "You called a line that logs every ring. Bring what you have, or the school gets a paper apology and nothing else." I played it twice, then a third time, and on the third play, I heard something quiet at the end, like a button pressed against fabric. Double click. It sounded like someone turning off a small recorder. I sent the audio to Monroe. She replied, "Familiar cadence?" Then, same double click on a training tape we use for stings. Then, after a beat, "We are not the only ones planning a record." Around sunset, the sky finally committed to rain. It put a sheen on the street that turned headlights into lines. I watched drops crawl down the window glass, divide, join, fall. Each one looked like a decision. I thought about the crash and the way the wipers had struggled to keep the windshield clear, and how I had leaned forward like distance could be shortened if I wanted it enough. I heard the pop again, the slide, the skidding scream of rubber. I could smell the coolant, sweet and wrong. I pressed the heel of my hand against my breastbone until the phantom pressure of the seatbelt eased. I wrote a note to myself. The crash is a voice, not a fact. It will speak, but it cannot veto the day. At 9, the hallway outside my door creaked the way old buildings do when they think no one is listening. A shadow paused under the crack, then moved on. I stood with the recorder in one hand and the microclip in the other, and waited for the sound of a key that didn't belong. It didn't come. I sat back down and looked at the card again, the number with no area code, the worn edges from years in a wallet. I wondered how many people had used that line, thinking they were calling for help when they were registering themselves as helpful. The next morning, Monroe called from a different payphone. She said the city inspector had lost the file on the garage for 8 hours yesterday and then found it after a deputy commissioner called to ask why her name was on anything that suggested follow-up. She said that was pressure, and pressure left fingerprints if you lifted it right. She said Carter had pulled a visitor log from the shared office building that showed the green coat had signed in 3 times with 3 different initials, each set matching a shell company from the list she gave me in the library. She said the initials formed a pattern if you laid them over the ledger dates. I told her about the box. She said the right move was to wait to see who moved after no one touched it. She said patience is surveillance's best friend. I said patience makes me feel like a target. She didn't disagree. She said, then we build you a bigger room to stand in. She meant more eyes, more copies, more people who would say my name if I couldn't. She asked if I had enough cash. I said yes. She said, buy a coat that doesn't look like your coat, and shoes your feet won't remember. Change makes patterns weaker. I bought a coat the color of sidewalks and shoes that felt like someone else's good idea. I ate soup again because the journalist's note had made warm food into a kind of shield. I printed 2 more sets of the ledger copies and mailed one to a friend from college I hadn't spoken to in years with a simple line, hold this, tell no one. I knew it was a risk to involve someone who hadn't chosen this. I also knew I was one fall away from becoming an empty room with a story that lived only in my head. At noon, a message came from the unknown style, a time and 2 letters, SB. I read it twice. Sanction Bay, then a line, show us the book or stop pretending to read. The anger that rose was clean, not the frantic kind. It made me feel present in my skin. I typed, school gets paid first. Then I erased it and wrote nothing. Let them think I was considering cooperation. Let them plan for me to be greedy or foolish. Let them plan for a version of me that no longer existed. I went back to the church and sat 2 rows from where I had sat with Claire. A man lit a candle and stood with his head bowed and his hands open. I tried to imagine Aaron doing that. I couldn't. I tried to imagine David standing in any room without a plan, and failed. I whispered to the wood, we are going to finish this. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The museum cafe welcomed me again, because places built for strangers never ask who you were yesterday. The journalist arrived with a folder and laid out evidence like a dealer who knows the table. Copies of the school's budget showing a line item that had been penciled in and then erased with care. A scanned image of the board minutes, noting a grant award pending audit that never occurred, a list of donors with addresses that led to empty suites and phone trees that never connected to a human voice. She tapped each page as if counting beats. Then she slid a photo across the table I hadn't expected to see. It was David, not in a coat this time, but in shirt sleeves, bent over a small table in a room with a gray wall and no windows. The camera angle high, the light flat. He was writing with a thin pen on a stack of cards, the kind I had found in my envelope under the hymnals, the kind people tuck into wallets because they make them feel like they belong to something. The timestamp matched the week of my crash. She said, "We got this from a source who hates him." I asked why the source hated him. She said, "Sometimes you don't need a reason beyond proximity and the way a person treats a person holding coffee." She said it almost lightly, then the steel returned to her voice. "He will deny. He will say he was helping with compliance. He will talk in sentences that have the shape of answers and the middle missing. So he will ask a question with dates and numbers and a copy of his face, doing the opposite of what he says." I looked at the photo until the image broke into small pieces. Hand, pen, cards. The slight twist of his mouth that I recognized from the stairwell when he told someone I trusted the wrong people. I felt anger and a kind of careful grief, not for him, for the hours I had spent believing in his competence as a shield. The journalist asked if I had heard from Claire. I shook my head. I told her about the text with SB and the demand for the book. She frowned and said, "They want you to bring the ledger to a place they control." I said I knew. She said, "Then don't." She slid another small device to me, this one like a keychain. She said, "If they get close, press this twice and throw it under something. It will shout into the air on a frequency people with radios can hear. It will not bring a cavalry, but it will invite attention they don't want." On my way out, a child bumped into my leg and said sorry in a voice that made me think of the school again. I wrote a figure on a donation form at the front desk that would not end any budget, but might buy new paper. I signed with my birth name and felt the letters like a statement to myself that I was not going to become only the person who had been hurt. Evening stretched long. I went to the library and booked a room and laid out the map again. Ledger to initials, initials to signatures, signatures to permits, permits to bays, bays to brakes, brakes to crash, crash to will, will to control, control to David, David to basement, basement to tablet, tablet to donor, donor to school, school to principal, principal to the certified letter to a file that kept being found and lost, found and lost, found and lost. The pattern was the point. I wrote beside it, "The school is the truth because it is the thing everyone forgot to feed." When I left, the street smelled like wet stone. A car idled at the corner. The driver looked down at his phone. Maybe he was waiting for a rideshare ping. Maybe he was waiting for me. I turned and walked the other way, counting storefronts the way you count breaths. One for the shop with the gold picture frames, one for the tailor with the obliging mannequins, one for the bakery that kept the lights on even when the racks were empty. In the motel, I lay down with my shoes still on and the recorder in my hand. I listened to the crash memory again, not through sound but through the body signals that bubble up when the mind is quiet. I told myself what the therapist had taught me. Memory is a room you can walk into and out of. You are not trapped there. I pictured a door. I pictured myself walking out and closing it gently. I pictured another door, this one labeled with the date, and the word tomorrow. I reached for it. The next morning at 6, the unknown number called. I let it ring, then answered with the recorder live and the clip under my collar. The voice said, "Bring the book to the shop at noon." I said, "The school first." The voice said nothing for a count of 5. Then, a different voice, smoother. "Your aunt would have understood." I felt heat in my chest. I said, "My aunt believed in receipts." The line cut. I called Monroe from a bus that rattled like honesty. I told her about the call. She said perfect, and I almost laughed at the word coming out of her mouth. She said, "We don't bring the ledger. We bring a page with the petty cash line blacked out, and we watch who tries to fill it in from memory." She said, "I'll be there, but you won't see me. If a man in a green coat appears, leave. If a man in a coat without a color appears, leave. If anyone uses the word donor like a person, leave." Noon came like a held breath. The shop smelled like tires and coffee gone old. Wasn't in the bay. A different man wiped his hands and didn't meet my eyes. I stood just inside the doorway where the camera could see me and everyone else could too. I said, "I was here for a service." The man shrugged and said, "We're booked." I said, "I have an appointment." He said, "Who with?" I said, "Tally." He looked at my shoes and then at the office door and then back at my shoes, like he was deciding what kind of story I was, the kind that leaves or the kind that stays and makes more work. The office door opened. A woman stepped out wearing a green coat, not bright, the color of pond water in winter. She carried a stack of folders and a pen that looked expensive without trying. Her eyes slid over the room and then landed on me. Not long, just long enough to mark. She said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I have a part number that does not exist." She smiled, the kind of smile people use when they need you to relax, and said, "Come in and we'll see what's possible." I did not go in. I stood where I was and took a page from my notebook and held it at my side. She noticed and did not pretend not to. She said, "That belongs in a drawer." I said, "This belongs to a school." Her smile didn't change, but the skin around her eyes did. She said, "The school will get what it needs after we make sure the gift is recognized properly." The word gift rolled off her tongue, smooth. I felt the recorder burning against my skin like a small sun. I said, "I want the check cut first." "Today," she said. "That isn't how these things work." I said, "It is now." The man with the rag dropped it into a bucket with a splash that sounded too loud. The woman in the green coat said, "You're tired. You're making this harder than it has to be." She took one step toward me. I took one step back until the door frame touched my shoulder blades and the outside air touched the back of my neck. She stopped and looked past me at the street, as if to remind me that the world had other concerns, that no one would notice if a conversation turned into a compromise. I said, "I have copies. The journalist has copies. The detective has copies. The school has a letter." She blinked slowly. The pen tapped once against the folders. She said, "Then you don't need to be here." I said, "I need to hear you say the name of the person who told David to stand beside my car." She said, "Names are for people who haven't learned how to work." Behind her, the office phone rang. She didn't move to answer it. She said, "Last chance. Bring the book and we will make the school whole." I said, "You already had chances." I put the page back in my bag and stepped sideways into the sunlight where the camera over the service door could see me fully. The woman didn't follow. She closed the office door with a softness that felt like an ending and a beginning both. I walked to the corner and kept walking until my legs told me to sit. I chose the bus stop by the precinct again. I called Monroe and told her every word. She said, "Good." She said we got what we needed. Carter had been across the street with a lens that could read the pen brand in her hand. He had captured the moment she stepped toward me, and the way the man with the rag looked at the office door when I said the word check. She said, "We will not use your face in anything until we have to." I said, "Use it if it gets the school paid." She said, "We will get there without making you the headline first." The journalist texted, "Board chair resigned, no statement." The principal just called me crying. "She thinks your aunt's ledger is the reason she didn't quit last year." Then, "Eat something." Then, "Tomorrow we present a draft to legal." Years ago, I ate a sandwich at a park table and watched a group of teenagers teach a younger kid how to ride a bike. The older one ran beside the small wobbling circle, hand on the back of the seat, and then let go without telling him. The kid pedaled 3 strokes on his own before he noticed. He shouted, not with fear, but with the shock of freedom, and then laughed so loudly a bird lifted from a branch. The sound cut through me in a healthy way. I wanted that sound for the school. I wanted it for me. That evening, I went back to the shared office building and took the elevator down again. The room at the end of the hall was empty. The box was gone. The note was gone. The table had a smear on it where tape had lifted paint. In the corner, the camera's little indicator blinked once and then went still like a tired eye. I stood in the doorway and let the emptiness register. A space where a trap had been felt, like a space in which a person could breathe. On the way out, I pressed my palm to the cool metal of the elevator wall and listened to the cables hum. I told myself that haunted does not mean helpless. I said it twice, softly, and the words held their shape. When the doors opened, the lobby's glass made the city into a puzzle of squares. I saw my reflection and did not flinch. Back in the room, I lay on the bed, fully dressed, and let the day replay once, like an editor watching footage. The green coat, the pen, the phrase, gift, the way she said last chance, the way I said check first, the way my voice did not break. I wrote one sentence on the notebook's next page. Tomorrow we count in public. Then I closed my eyes and listened, not for breaks or glass, but for the ordinary hum of the motel air, steady and indifferent, a noise that belonged to no one and meant nothing except that I was still here to hear it. 2 days later, the silence changed texture. It wasn't relief. It was rearrangement. Monroe's number stopped ringing. The journalist's email started bouncing back with a message that said, "Account suspended due to unusual activity." The school's website went offline for scheduled maintenance. The pattern was too tight to be coincidence. Someone had pulled a cord, and the lights were going out in sequence. I went to the library to check the online archives for the grant filings. The search engine that used to show public PDFs now returned error 403, access denied. I tried the state transparency portal, same thing. My laptop screen reflected my face, pale, exhausted, and suddenly irrelevant. Information had turned into property overnight. I called the newspaper front desk and asked for the journalist by name. The receptionist said she didn't know anyone by that name. I said maybe I had the wrong section. She repeated the sentence, word for word, same tone, like a recording. I hung up and felt the world tilt again. You spend months dragging truth into daylight and then watch someone dim the bulbs without even sweating. A message arrived from an unknown sender. We appreciate your cooperation. The matter is now closed. No signature, no threat, just the bureaucratic rhythm of closure. I read it 3 times and realized how elegant control sounds when it pretends to be polite. I forwarded to every address I had for Monroe. No reply. That night, I walked to the precinct bus stop again, the one with the camera over the bench. I sat there until my legs went numb. I wanted the camera to remember me, to record that I was still trying. I looked straight at the lens and said quietly, "This isn't over." I don't know if it picked up my voice, but the red indicator blinked once like it heard me. By morning, my motel keycard stopped working. The clerk said my payment hadn't cleared. I checked my wallet. The cash was there, but my backup debit card read "Transaction declined" at every ATM. Accounts frozen. The same polite closure in financial form. I laughed out loud in the empty lobby. The sound startled the clerk enough that he didn't argue when I left without another night paid. I found a cheap room near the river, where the walls smelled like mildew and bleach. The TV flickered between static and a news anchor discussing irregularities in several charitable audits. But the names were blurred under legal review. They had taken the nouns away and left the adjectives. I sat on the bed and watched the story dissolve into safe vagueness. Late afternoon, a letter slid under the door. No envelope, just folded paper. Inside, a printed statement on plain white with a government seal watermark faint enough to make you squint. This correspondence serves as notification that ongoing investigations referenced in previous communications are considered resolved. Continued inquiry may constitute interference. No signature again, only initials typed in gray, DH. It could have been David. It could have been a coincidence. Bureaucracy loves coincidence. I tore the letter into strips and flushed them one at a time, watching each piece disappear as if that meant it couldn't follow me. When I came back from the sink, my phone was vibrating, a restricted number. I answered. A calm male voice said, "You're tired. Let it rest." I said, "You already tried to make me rest once, with breaks and paperwork." Silence. Then, "You misunderstand. This isn't about you anymore." I almost smiled at that. "That's what they all say," I said, and hung up. For the next 2 days, every system that used to respond to me stopped doing so. The library card wouldn't scan. The public computer logins rejected my name. Even the payphones in the district downtown swallowed coins without connecting. I started to feel like the city had been programmed to forget me on purpose. But forgetting works both ways. The more they raced, the lighter I became. I couldn't stop the system, but I could document the erasure. I wrote dates and details in my notebook. Website down, account frozen, library lockout, call intercepted, evidence of absence. Proof that silence was active, not accidental. On the 3rd night, Monroe appeared in the reflection of the diner window. She sat down without speaking, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that wasn't hers. She looked older, she said. They pushed me out. I asked if she still had her badge. She shook her head. Internal audit, they said conflict of interest. They didn't even use my name in the report, just consultant, and told her about the emails, the letter, the frozen cards. She nodded like she'd expected it. It's standard containment. They seal the edges first. Next, they'll release a version of events with your name in the wrong place. They'll make you a footnote in your own story. I asked what to do. She said, don't fight the narrative directly. Tell it sideways. She slid a flash drive across the table. Everything we backed up from the basement cameras before they wiped the servers. Carter pulled it from the system clock. I asked where Carter was. She didn't answer. She just said, he recorded enough. Outside, sirens passed, but didn't stop. Monroe said quietly, they think if they discredit you, they erase what happened, but the footage doesn't care who believes it. She stood to leave, coat collar up. Upload it somewhere nobody expects, she said. Not to prove you're right, just to make the lie harder to hold. When she left, I sat there with the flash drive in my hand, its plastic warm from her palm. The waitress refilled my cup without asking and said, you look like you've had a long week. I said, long year. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that keeps the world from turning to stone. I finished the coffee, tucked the drive into my notebook, and walked out into the thin rain. The streetlights came on one by one, each a small pulse of defiance. Every system that had shut me out still had gaps, light leaking through cracks, data fragments that couldn't be erased all at once. Somewhere in those gaps, the truth still existed, and that, I decided, was where I would live until it surfaced again. I spent the night walking the river path until my feet ached and the fog off the water stuck to my hair. The flash drive Monroe gave me sat in my pocket like a hot coin. Every time I touched it, my mind tried to rewrite the last year into something simpler, but the body doesn't care about the story you wish you were in. It cares about the proof you can hold. The systems that had shut me out taught me something. If they were going to close doors, I had to use windows. I bought a used laptop at a pawn shop that smelled like dust and old speakers. I paid in cash, powered it up outside under the awning, and tore the tape off the webcam. I wiped the machine in the library parking lot on public Wi-Fi and disabled everything that liked to talk without asking. Then I plugged in the drive. The folder structure was bare like a room with a single bulb. Time-stamped clips from the basement, the bay, the corridor where the green coat passed through carrying nothing and left carrying a box. I watched them with the sound low. Even with no audio, I could hear the shape of what happened. The man in the coat, who was David without being named, the hooded mechanic, a small reflection in the window that turned somebody's habit into evidence. I exported 3 clips and renamed them in the most boring way I could think of: janitorial_1, inventory_13, inspection_7. I didn't plan to upload them where headlines live, not yet. I wanted the truth to start small and stubborn. I printed 3 QR codes at the copy shop. One led to the clips hosted in a cloud folder that wasn't tied to my name. One led to the certified letter number from the school. One led to a text page that just said, "Count with me," and listed dates, amounts, and initials. I taped the codes to the community board in the library, to the church bulletin beneath the announcements for the food pantry, and to a cork board in the laundromat over a flyer for a lost cat. I watched no one notice. Then I left, because quiet beginnings are meant to be left alone to do their work. By noon, an email pinged from an account I didn't recognize. No greeting, just "Saw janitorial_1. Who are you?" I answered from a new address. I wrote, "Someone who keeps receipts." They replied with a link to a forum where school parents traded tips about bus routes and lunch forms. Someone had posted the QR with a line, "Is this why the grant never came?" The replies were a flood of question marks and careful anger. Parents don't write like lawyers. They write like people who have to feed children on schedules that do not allow for nonsense. The thread grew. Then it was gone. The moderators removed it. For tone, I saved screenshots and put them in a folder labeled Weather. At 3, a text arrived from a new number. The foundation will release a statement clarifying misunderstandings. Clarifying is a word people use when they're about to bend light. I sent the text to Monroe. She called from a borrowed phone and said, "They'll offer a review. They'll promise best practices. They'll invite the auditor who signed at 2:12 a.m. to bless the same numbers again." I said, "The parents saw the clips." She said, "Good. The clips teach faster than statements." The school site flickered back online with a polite banner about maintenance. A new page appeared, titled Frequently Asked Questions. It said, "Grants take time, audits protect children, and rumors hurt staff morale." I copied the text into my notebook and wrote next to it, "Rumor is their word for our math." I stood outside the school fence at dismissal with my hood up. I didn't approach anyone. I just listened. Parents spoke in low voices. One of them said, "If this was nothing, they wouldn't be so calm." Another said, "If this was something, they'd sue." Both were right. The system prefers the middle, where nothing moves and nobody can grab hold. I mailed another set of copies to a P.O. box that belonged to a retired teacher who ran the neighborhood newsletter. She printed birthdays and bake sale times and the names of kids who won the spelling bee, the kind of pages people keep on refrigerators. I slid a note inside that said, "If you print this, consider putting it beside the recipe." Then I walked home, alongside streets that kept secrets better than I did. At dusk, someone knocked on my door. 3 slow taps. I didn't move. Another 3. I slid the recorder on and stepped to the side. "Who is it?" I asked. "A delivery," a woman's voice said. "Wrong address, maybe." I opened the door with the chain on. The hallway was empty. On the floor sat a bakery box tied with string. The label read, "Compliments of the Foundation." I didn't touch it. I took a photo, then another from lower down, like a person who knows angles matter. I carried the box on the palm of my hand to the dumpster and set it on the lid. When I walked away, I heard a small click from inside the cardboard, like a spring giving up. I didn't turn back. The next morning, the newsletter arrived with my copies on page 3, squeezed between community yard sale and congratulations to Mrs. Patel on 30 years. The editor had written at the top, "We do not vouch for any claims, but we vouch for the idea that neighbors deserve clarity." The QR codes printed fuzzy but scannable. By lunchtime, 3 more parents emailed the forum screenshots to me with the subject line, "Counting." By late afternoon, a lawyer from a firm with a kind name called. He said he represented the foundation and that his client was concerned about misinformation spreading in ways that could harm philanthropy. He suggested a meeting to align on facts. I said, "Bring a check for the school." He said, "It's not that simple." I said, "It is." He switched to a tone reserved for confused people and said, "You're exposing yourself." I said, "That's the point." He hung up with a sigh that sounded practiced. An hour later, my old landlord called to say a certified letter had arrived with my name on it. I asked him to open it on speaker. He did. Inside, a notice stating that a tax lien was being considered on funds from an inheritance because of unresolved documentation. He read the phrase twice. I felt anger rise clean again. The playbook was old. If they couldn't bury the story, they would bury me in paperwork. I thanked him, asked him to hold the letter, and sent a photo of it to the journalist's backup address. She had created it before her main line vanished. 10 minutes later, she wrote back, "Good. Now we subpoena the records they're pretending to want." Night fell heavy. My body wanted to sleep, but my mind insisted on doing rounds. I opened the recorder and spoke slow. "If you're me tomorrow, remember that the erasure is proof. The maintenance banner is proof. The letter with no signature is proof. The bakery box with a spring is proof. They do not do this for stories that are easy to ignore." Near midnight, a new thread appeared in the parents' forum, reposted by someone who knew how to make screenshots survive moderation. It showed a line from the Foundation's annual report in small print. Unrestricted funds may be used at the discretion of the board. The poster had typed under it, "Who is the board?" Another parent replied, "Public record, right?" A third posted the directory of the shared office building with the mailbox numbers circled. The dots connected in public, not because I forced them to, but because people who feed kids don't like being told to look away. The next day, the school held a meeting in the gym. Chairs in rows, a microphone that squealed before behaving. I sat in the back near the exit, like I always do now. The principal spoke in careful sentences about stewardship and process. Then she said something that made the room shift. We asked for a check. We were told to wait. She didn't say who told her. She didn't have to. A murmur moved across the floor like a breeze. A parent stood and asked, "Who is the board?" Another asked, "What is petty cash for if not glue sticks and field trips?" A third said, "Why is an auditor signing at 2 in the morning?" A district representative stepped up and inserted himself between the microphone and the questions. He said, "The district appreciates the community's engagement and has commissioned a review." He used the word clarify 3 times. He used the word rumor once. He did not use the words check, bay, or basement. People in chairs looked at one another with the kind of expression that means trust has moved out. When the meeting ended, I stood to leave, but the principal saw me and nodded once, a tiny movement that said more than any speech. It said, "Keep going." It said, "I'm still here." On my way back, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize, the kind with digits that look arranged by hand. "Stop using children." I stopped on the sidewalk, read the line twice, and felt something like steel form in my back. I typed, "Stop taking from them." I didn't send it. Some replies don't deserve your breath. I saved a screenshot instead. That night, the journalist's backup email lit up. Legal says we can publish the clips if we blur faces and treat the ledger as source material rather than evidence. We need one more on-the-record voice. I stared at the line. On the record is a door you can't close once you open it. I looked at my reflection in the motel window. Haunted, yes. Helpless, no. I typed, "Use my birth name." She replied, "Are you sure?" I wrote, "I'm counting in public." Then I hit send and put the phone down like it might burn a hole through the night. In the morning, the parents' forum had a new pinned post from a moderator who had previously removed everything with the word grant. "We're pausing deletions. Keep it factual. Keep it kind." Below it was a link to a local blog that had published the blurred clip of a man in a coat watching a wheel come off and go back on at 2 in the morning. The caption said only, "Questions for the board." I walked to the river and watched the mist lift. My accounts were still frozen. The letter with no signature still sat in a landlord's drawer. The foundation statement would land any minute with the precision of a calendar invite. But the story had slipped their grip in a way that felt quiet and permanent. They had turned off the big lights, so we lit 100 small ones. The article went live on a Wednesday. Not front page, not scandal fonts, just a clean headline in the middle column. Missing audit trail raises questions for regional foundation. No names, only initials. No photo, only a still from the blurred clip where the man's coat folded light. But people knew. They always do. That morning, my phone lit up with messages that didn't need answers. Old friends I hadn't heard from since before the crash. One said, "I read it. You were right." Another said, "Be careful." The school sent out a statement thanking community members whose diligence ensured transparency. The words tasted like diplomacy, but they were true enough. I walked to the river again. The fog sat low, and the air carried that metallic smell that lives between rain and electricity. Across the water, cranes moved slow above construction lots, the city fixing itself without waiting for permission. I realized I wasn't afraid anymore, just tired. The kind of tired that comes after finishing a sentence that took a year to say. By noon, the foundation issued its response. They promised a third-party review, a restructuring, new oversight. The lawyer called again to say there'd be no further action if I refrained from escalation. I laughed quietly. They didn't understand that escalation wasn't mine to control anymore. Parents had the files, teachers had the emails, the ledger was already public in the only way that mattered, by word of mouth. That evening, Monroe called from a prepaid line. Her voice sounded lighter. She said, "The board's under federal audit now. Carter's name made the memo." I asked if that was good. She said, "It's real. Real is better than good." Then she said, "You did it." I told her we all did. She didn't answer, just breathed into the line for a few seconds before hanging up. The next day, I went back to the church. The pews smelled of old polish. The light through the stained glass made the dust look like small galaxies. I sat in the same spot and whispered. We counted. For the first time, the words didn't tremble, and outside people were talking, not about scandal, but about schedules, lunches, repairs, life folding itself around the story instead of stopping for it. That's how survival looks, messy, ordinary, unfinished. I found myself at the bakery window, the same one where the foundation had once sent a box meant to frighten me. Now the glass reflected only bread, warmth, hands moving fast behind the counter. I went in and bought a loaf. The woman at the register smiled and said, "We're donating tomorrow's leftovers to the school lunch drive." I nodded and said, "Good." It was all I could manage. Back in my room, I packed the last of my notes into a cardboard box. The real kind, not a trap. I labeled it simply, "For the record." Then I sat down, opened the recorder, and spoke what I knew would be my final note. I used to think justice would feel like light. It doesn't. It feels like gravity returning. like air coming back into a room you didn't realize was thin. If someone finds this, tell them the truth is smaller than stories, but stronger than silence. Tell them we counted out loud. I turned the recorder off, set it on the table, and listened to the hum of the city outside. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was real, and real, as Monroe said, was better than good. The Foundation's audit report was released 6 weeks later. No scandal headline, no names in bold, just the quiet admission that certain transactions were inconsistent with best practice. In bureaucracy, that sentence is the equivalent of a confession. The school got its check 2 days after. The principal sent me a photo. New books stacked in the library. Children holding them open like small doors. No caption, just one line. You were right to count. The journalist called once, voice steady, softer than before. She said, "They're pretending it was internal oversight." I said, "Let them pretend the money moved." She paused. "What will you do now?" He said, "Live quietly, if the world lets me." After that, I moved 2 cities away. A smaller apartment, a view of a bridge, and planted basil on the windowsill because my aunt used to say a kitchen isn't alive until something grows in it. Some mornings I wake before sunrise and still hear the rain from the crash, faint, like an echo living under the skin. Other mornings I forget for whole hours that any of it happened. I kept 1 copy of the ledger, not as evidence, just memory. The pages smell like dust and ink and time. Sometimes I open it and trace her handwriting, the neat lines, the calm precision of someone who believed numbers could hold people accountable. She was right. It just took longer than either of us expected. Last week, the school newspaper ran a story written by 8th graders about how grown-ups fixed something broken. They didn't mention my name. They didn't have to. The first line said, "When people keep receipts, the world gets fairer." I laughed until I cried. At night, I sat by the river again. The water moved slow, reflecting the city lights like a heartbeat, finally steady. I thought about Monroe, about the journalist, about the parents who refused to look away. I thought about the cost, the crash, the scars that healed crooked. Then I thought about the children reading new books under real light, not borrowed promises. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel haunted, just here. I pressed record one last time and said, "This is the end of the ledger. The totals are balanced." We counted every page, and it was enough